Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us. I'm Nick Gowing, your chair for the 11th Sustainable Innovation Forum, host for 5 days of 3-hour sessions of dialogue and debate, taking us to the cutting edge of where sustainability is now, where the climate emergency is taking us. Right now, of course, many of us should be in Glasgow for the meeting in person for the UNFCCC's 26th Conference of the Parties, the COP26. But instead, we're all grappling with the more immediate threat of the COVID-19 emergency, that global health emergency. Environmental diplomacy has to some extent been put on hold, but we can't just postpone the climate emergency as if it's not happening. Momentum has to be maintained. It has to be intensified. There are signs that this is now possible, particularly with the political developments in the US and the new commitment from China. This is what is driving this Sustainable Innovation Forum. This is why we are here this week.
Global warming is an existential threat to humanity. We're going to pass the point of no return within the next 8 to 10 years. We don't have much time.
So let me underline that last graphic, those 5 points you saw: showcasing innovation, building momentum, raising ambition, shaping policy, and above all, enabling partnerships, bringing more of you together, maybe people you've never spoken to before. What is going to happen over the next 5 days? Well, here we go. We're going to be talking in the next 5 days, first of all today, on climate policy and finance, day one. Second, energy transition, that's on Tuesday. On day 3, sustainable mobility and the youth agenda, critical, that youth agenda, the next generation. Fourthly, industry transition. And fifthly, on Friday, land use and agriculture, with a particular intervention from His Royal Highness Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales. This week, all this is framed by 2 horizons. We can call them 2 horizons. First, what must the next 12 months achieve ahead of COP26 in Glasgow? Which reinforces the second question. We've now entered the decade for action. Will the decisions we make today really align the world to the goals of the Paris Agreement 5 years ago? Will we deliver, and can we deliver? A little bit at this point about climate action. Formed in 2007, climate action is set up to unite, to bring together the private, public, and NGO communities for this critical issue of sustainability through digital and live platforms. Digital like today, live like we've been doing up until the COVID-19 epidemic has hit us all. Building stronger partnerships and communities, accelerating international sustainable development, emphasis there on the word accelerate, and advancing the Paris Agreement. We now assume, as I said earlier, with full US engagement under a Biden administration and a new declaration of a Chinese commitment. Well, this year, CIF 2020 forms part of Climate Action's much wider roadmap to the COP26. That is the Sustainable Innovation Forum 2020, That is COP26 in Glasgow. But you can see the history here, the heritage that has been built up for this process of the Sustainable Innovation Forum, right from COP16 in Cancun through Durban, Doha, Warsaw, Lima, Paris, Marrakesh, Bonn, Katowice, Madrid, and hopefully Glasgow next year. It's designed to get all of you together, and please feel you are part of that process. Join us on this roadmap to COP26. So what are we going to be talking about on day one? As the world really works to rebuild at the moment, will the decisions we make today keep us on track for net zero and in line with 2030 targets? 2030 targets. The session today covers three distinct topics: the Green New Deal, the global Green New Deal, decision-making for greater climate ambition under all those umbrellas that I've been highlighting for you already, and the green fiscal stimulus. So what's the agenda for the next 3 hours on this day one? First, we'll hear from this week's headline partner, BMW Group, on their new journey to create mobility which is appropriate for a green recovery. Our first virtual panel will debate if a global Green Deal is even possible right now. Is it possible? Then we'll be joined by a senior executive from SAP, the giant accounting software group. How can changing software design actually force corporates to realign the way they judge success, not just by profit, but success? What kind of metrics? That's fascinating. Then we'll have a 45-minute break and a live discussion after that with UNEP, with the Finance Initiative, and also Oliver Wyman, who are the global leaders in management and risk consulting. The question for them: are businesses taking climate risk seriously? Are businesses taking climate risk seriously? Then we'll round off today with another panel chaired by Nick Robbins from the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics. He'll steer today's final panel of financial stakeholders, and asking the question, can the green stimulus close the 2.5 trillion SDG investment gap? And there's been a remarkable conference in the last week here in London on the green horizons. Remarkable push forward by the financial community. That'll be reflected in this panel at the end of today. Before we move into those live sessions, we have a message from Ban Ki-moon. He's president and chair of the Global Green Growth Institute. And of course, he was the 8th UN Secretary General. Ban Ki-moon.
Greetings to all taking part in this 2020 Sustainable Innovation Forum. 2020 was meant to usher in a decade of climate action. However, we have faced another threat, COVID-19, and we will face more suffering as a result of this pandemic in the months to come. But we must not pause our action on climate change. The climate emergency remains one of the greatest existential threats facing humanity. We stand at a crossroads. Historically, while pandemics have caused great loss and suffering, they have also galvanized change. As we consider our present challenges, we must also question which parts of the business as usual are worth returning to when we come out of the pandemic. We do not stand at this juncture with no roadmap. We already have a framework for action: the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement on climate change. The SDGs recognize the need for interconnected solutions. The Paris Agreement can help guide us in ensuring our economic recovery is based on policies that promote green growth, protect biodiversity, and embrace renewable energy. The science tells us that the window of opportunity to address climate change is closing. While COP26 in Glasgow has been delayed, our action must not be. We have a chance in the economic recovery from COVID-19 to encourage leadership and support from businesses, cities, regions, and investors to create a healthy, resilient, and zero emissions future. The United Nations Secretary General has set out clear principles to guide the recovery. Fiscal firepower must drive a shift from the gray to a green economy. We must use this moment to end investment in fossil fuel extraction and instead focus on renewable energy and clean technologies. There is no place for coal. And in our global recovery, we must leave no one behind. Vulnerable nations are facing an unprecedented collective threat to human life, livelihoods, and economic devastation. If poorer countries are to be able to afford a green recovery from COVID-19, they need financial support to do so. And we do not want a case where countries put substantial investment into renewable energy at home, whilst still financing their companies to export fossil fuel worldwide. Finally, to achieve any of this, we must work together as an international community. The climate crisis is not just a crisis for the climate. Without adequate collective action, we must unraveling decades of hard-earned progress on improving global health, tackling poverty, and reducing inequalities. But if we get things right, we can steer a sustainable and inclusive global recovery for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Moon. There must be adequate collective action on multiple fronts, he was underscoring. Let me tell you that this entire week is officially supporting the Race to Zero campaign, and it's part of the London Climate Action Week. The day one partners today are SAP, and the strategic partner is Oliver Wyman. But our headline partner is the BMW Group. Special thanks to them. They've been supporting this forum for the last 6 years. Delighted that they are supporting us again. And here is Senior Vice President for Corporate Strategy, Florian Weig.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the introduction, Nick. And I would like to thank the 8th UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon for his inspiring call to action. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Florian Weig from the BMW Group. I am delighted to be speaking to you here today, and I want to start by conveying warm regards from our group headquarters here in Munich. The BMW Group has been actively involved in the United Nations climate change conferences since 1992. Unfortunately, we can only get together for a virtual meeting this year, but I already look forward to COP26 in Glasgow next year. Participating in the Sustainable Innovation Forum means a lot to us, and we are pleased to be a part of this event again in 2021. COVID-19 has thrown the world economy, of course, almost overnight. The BMW Group has been affected along with everybody else. But the pandemic is also an accelerator, for instance, for electric mobility. More about that in a moment. Despite the crisis, we won't be compromising on sustainability, climate, and environmental protection. These are top priorities for the future of our society. As a company, we are part of this society and we are aware of our responsibility. Because we are aware of what the 8th UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said in his speech, if we get things right, we can steer a sustainable and inclusive recovery for all. Sustainability has a long tradition with us. During the oil embargo of 1973, we were the first automotive manufacturer to appoint an environmental officer for the company. Because environmental issues are of central importance for car makers in particular. More specifically, sustainability has shaped our decisions and strategy for almost half a century. We are fully committed to the Paris Climate Agreement and are keeping up the pace, over-complying with CO2 emission limits. Despite the pandemic, we are taking things a step further this year. Corporate success and sustainability are inseparable. This is why we are taking sustainability to the next level, putting it at the center of our corporate strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't do sustainability at BMW. We make BMW sustainable. Sustainability makes products all the more popular, and it makes their use and consumption guilt-free. The development of electromobility shows this very clearly. E-mobility has proven to be a substantial sales driver in these difficult times. By the end of September of this year, we sold over 100,000 electrified vehicles. Altogether, we have put more than 600,000 electrified BMWs on the road worldwide. Despite the pandemic, we will meet the European carbon dioxide target this year and next. In 2020 alone, our fleet consumption is about 20% down year on year, an accomplishment we are very proud of. We laid the groundwork for this as early as 2013 with a fully electric BMW i3. Project I rang in phase 1 of the transformation towards sustainable mobility. The BMW i3 has since sold over 200,000 times and is already today a sought-after icon. Now, as demand for electric mobility is picking up pace, we are entering phase 2 of the transformation with highly innovative vehicles. By 2023, we will have a total of 25 electrified BMW models on the road, 12 of them fully electric. In the coming years, we are planning to electrify all model series. By the end of 2021, we will have 5 fully electric series production vehicles: the BMW i3, the Mini Cooper SE, BMW iX3, BMW iX, and BMW i4. Another milestone will be the next generations of the BMW 7 Series, 5 Series and X1, each fully electric. The iX celebrated its premiere here in Munich on November 11th. Ladies and gentlemen, sustainable mobility does not start with the car. We take a holistic view of the topic, expanding our production network for e-mobility and components and investing in research and development. These investments will prepare us for phase 3 in the second half of the decade. We ensure the expansion of digital connectivity and suitability for high volume production. This is how we can optimize our footprint. Thanks to the new cluster architecture, every BMW plant worldwide will be able to produce one of our electric cars. Our new plant in Hungary will play a key role in these efforts. Our new architecture, centered around battery electric vehicles, will be launched there in the mid-2020s. To make an effective contribution to climate protection, we continuously improve the overall environmental footprint of our products, from resources to recycling. The greater the share of e-mobility, the more the focus is shifting to carbon dioxide reductions in the supply chain. The production of the high voltage batteries uses a lot of energy. Up to 40% of carbon emissions in fully electric vehicles are generated in battery cell production, depending on production site and electricity mix. Around 1/3 directly by the cell manufacturer. This is where we start with our CO2 reduction. And my colleague Dr. Thomas Becker, Vice President for Sustainability and Mobility, will talk more about the circular economy in his interview on November 18th. To conclude, I would like to underscore once more just how important sustainability is at the BMW Group. The BMW Group is fully committed to the Paris Climate Agreement. We are setting a course that is much more ambitious than the 2 degrees target. We provide input to establish a circular economy that works in the long term. Sustainability and corporate success belong together. This approach is also reflected in the remuneration of the Board of Management and senior executives. Ladies and gentlemen, it was a pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you for your attention and have an inspiring SIF 2020.
Florian Weig joining us from BMW, and we'll be joined live by Thomas Becker on Wednesday afternoon, European time. So make sure that you put your questions, your comments to us in advance of that. And that's a central part of what we're trying to do, making this a two-way process all this week. All the sessions are being recorded, by the way. Everything can be reviewed again on demand. There'll be transcriptions as well. There's a virtual expo throughout the week. Connect with other partners and our partners, set up meetings with their teams, access and download the latest reports and papers, and you can interact all week, so please go there. And use the virtual platform as well, and all its features: network, connect, and collaborate. Do take advantage of the chat groups as well. And please bookmark the sessions you most want to watch live. You can see those on the agenda. And let me remind you, this week is about sharing ideas, building your networks, building more contacts as well. How can you get in contact with us? Well, this is the way. Go to our live discussion, go to click on questions, let us know your organizations. It would be great that you're not anonymous and we know who's talking to us and to whom you might be addressing your point, because obviously we need to somehow filter through those. And you can also talk to us on Twitter as well, through Climate Action, @climate_action. Here it is, @climate_action_, or at Climate Action Live hashtag, or hashtag SIF20. Right, so let's move now to the first session. Global Green Deal, can we do it? And what does it really mean? Joining us from New York is Cassie Flynn, who's Strategic Advisor on Climate Change at the UN Development Programme. Cassie, over to you.
Thank you so very much, Nick, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone around the world watching us for the Sustainable Innovation Forum. We are so happy to have you. And certainly with this panel, we want to dive right into these issues that we have heard so much about this morning. As Ban Ki-moon mentioned, we have this window of opportunity that we really need to focus on. How can we take climate action as boldly and as ambitiously and as urgently as possible? And of course, when even just a year ago we were talking about climate action, I don't think anyone really thought that the COVID crisis would be quite around the corner. And so now climate action takes on an entirely new meaning. What does it look like to have everyone around the world coming together to address this collectively? And so today with this panel, I am so pleased to be joined by three fantastic leaders. The first, Diederik Samson, the head of cabinet to First Vice President Frans Timmermans in the European Commission. Diederik is a Dutch environmentalist and retired politician who served the Labour Party, where he, among other things, was responsible for energy policies and initiating that very groundbreaking Dutch climate law. Since November 2019, Samson is the head of cabinet for First Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans. Welcome, Diederik. And next we have Rodolfo Lassi, the director of the Environment Directorate of OECD. He has been Vice Minister of Environmental Policy and Planning at the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources of Mexico. He was the chief negotiator of climate change for the government and the co-chair of the Global Methane Initiative and member of the high-level group of Global Environmental Outlook and board member of the Climate Action Reserve in California. Welcome, Rodolfo.
Thank you.
And very happy to have Maria Mendeluthe, who is the CEO of We Mean Business and has 25 years of experience in sustainable development, energy, and climate action to deliver an ambitious 5-year strategy. Maria was formerly managing director of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and also held senior positions at the Economic Bureau of the Spanish Prime Minister in the CEO's office of Iberdrola and the International Energy Agency. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you.
And so we are just going to dive right in today. We are going to start thinking about, well, what does it look like to have a global Green Deal? What does it mean? How can this be achieved? And I would so appreciate for the three of you to be able to give some of your first reflections on that, to kick us off in terms of how you think this could be achieved and what really do you think needs to be at the heart of it? So, Diederik, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Kathy. And forgive me my slight bias, but a global Green Deal could look a little like the European Green Deal, which we launched about 11 months ago before COVID-19 entered our lives and turned the world upside down. And by then, we launched a revolutionary plan that was different from normal environmental policies, because for once, we didn't settle for, let's say, the lowest common denominator, the feasible. No, we went for that, what was necessary in order to preserve our ecosystem. And therefore, we did not only concentrate on climate, but also on biodiversity and stopping the pollution of our environment. So for once, a consistent, comprehensive plan to save our ecosystem. And come to think of it, that is pretty logical. There is only one ecosystem. We live in it, we live from it, and we should preserve it. And we know everything within it is connected with everything else, as we do experience now all the more in the COVID-19 times. That was before COVID, and we have since adapted the European Green Deal to the new circumstances, the new context of Corona. And that obviously poses huge extra challenges, but also extra opportunities, because we all face now the same challenge of rebuilding our economy after the crash of COVID-19. And when rebuilding, why not build back better in one time, instead of going back to the old economy and then trying to green it? So we have that once in a lifetime, once in a century maybe, opportunity to really muster all the resources that we have, human and financial and creative, to rebuild this economy into a sustainable one. And there, with that, the Green Deal is now not only an environmental policy, but also a new growth model, turning away from the obsolete fossil fuels and going towards a sustainable, circular, and also more fair economy. And in this, trying to convert a European Green Deal into a global Green Deal, obviously Europe would like, or once has the commitment, to lead by example. And hence, we are going to upgrade our NDC at the end of the year. So in only a month's time, hopefully towards at least minus 55 targets, going towards climate neutrality in 2050. And we reach out to the rest of the world, reaching out with financial resources, with help, but also with a bit more assertive approach. And that is what we call the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. We want to reach out to the rest of the world. And if the rest of the world embarks on this journey, we are going to do it together. If not, we have to protect our own environmental integrity by installing such a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And you can see the evolution of Europe towards a more vigilant player, making a climate neutral future reality. And with that plan, with that idea, with that commitment, I think the next decade provides us with the last, but also the best opportunity to make this happen.
Thank you so much, Diederik. I mean, certainly this idea of the last and best opportunity is exactly what I think all of these conversations are really trying to grapple with, and hearing about your experience and with that inclusive approach is something that is so critical. Rodolfo, let me turn to you. How do you see this global Green Deal emerging? What do we need to be thinking about?
Well, it's a very good question because we used to have very different, or not very different, but different kind of paradigms. We were talking about sustainable development, later green growth. China, for example, that now is aligning the goals with this net zero target, is talking about the ecological civilization. This is why we have to think in this comprehensive approach that it was talking about. This is a decisive moment for the global economy because our governments are trying to recover the pace of the economic growth. In order to do that, they are supporting all kinds of economic activities that were impacted for the pandemic. But we have to think that we would like to have a new normal, creating wealth, creating jobs. Of course, we are hoping to create green jobs, investing in those businesses, in those production activities that can give us the opportunity to keep the way of life, the quality of life that we are enjoying now. We used to enjoy, at least at the beginning of the year. But this is a challenging moment because sometimes our governments are reacting and taking only in consideration short-term objectives. The good news is that many countries are making green recovery measures a central part of stimulus packages to drive sustainable, inclusive, resilient income of job creation and improve well-being in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. We recently launched a report on this. The name of the report is Making the Green Recovery Work for Jobs, Income and Growth. And this report indicates that OECD members have committed 312 billion US dollars of public resources to a green recovery, according to a preliminary estimate that will be refined in the coming months. While important, this figure needs to be compared with the overall of fiscal stimuli, which is about 9 trillion. You have to remember that we were looking for the trillions. Instead of talking about 100 billion, that was the commitment from developed countries to developing countries every year in the implementation phase of the Paris Agreement. We were, of course, looking for the trillions because we need more or less 70 trillion every year to really invest in infrastructure in the key sectors in our economies. As many countries are doing, our goals to the Paris Agreement. But some countries are also implementing measures that risk having a negative environmental impact and locking in unsustainable growth. We have to recognize that. So in a new Green Deal, we cannot support, for example, dirty industries. We cannot support investments in those factories, in those production activities that are emitting not only greenhouse gases, but also pollutants and are creating problems in the ocean or in the forest or in many other ecosystems that are vital for the preservation of life and are vital to tackle this massive biodiversity loss that we are suffering right now. So a new Green Deal must be, as now we are seeing very clearly, a comprehensive deal that covers the whole spectrum of environmental emergencies that are very clear examples of why we are not doing well in all these international environmental regimes that are in place but are not sufficient. We have to have a different kind of arrangement among the countries. Otherwise, we will not succeed with all these goals, very ambitious targets that we have.
Thank you so much, Rodolfo. I think, talking about this rapid change that we need to be making, and you really spoke to this sort of economic reality underneath it, and the types of choices that have to be made, both in a policy and a finance way, to be able to really promote the type of advancements that we need. And you really mentioned that keyword, which is jobs. How can we ensure that a global Green Deal really pushes this job protection and creation that we need? Maria, let me turn to you. Certainly, as the CEO of We Mean Business, the role of business is key in this. Can you say a little bit about what you're seeing from your vantage point?
Thank you. So, not surprisingly, I'm going to repeat some of the messages that we have already heard, because I think it's really clear that the new Green Deal, or Global Green Deal, it's a long-term economic recovery plan to make countries more resilient to the systemic crisis that they face. And in our view, there are three big systemic crises that the world is facing. One is climate change. Second one is the social inequality. You mentioned the issue around jobs. And the third one is nature. Hence, these green recovery packages need to create a growth opportunity, create more jobs, and reduce emissions. And we know that this can be done because we have done an analysis with Cambridge Economics that shows that at global level, in Europe, in the US, Japan, India, in all those countries, a green recovery package can deliver more growth, more jobs, and less emissions. Business massively support green recovery plans. Around 1,200 companies have addressed letters to heads of states and different governments to ask for a green recovery. It is imperative that these stimulus packages do not back high carbon pathways, which would lock us into an unsustainable path. It will generate stranded assets, and it's really not a smart thing to do. So the green recovery is, I think, it's the only way forward these days. And so I'm looking forward to discuss more with you during this panel.
Thank you, Maria. Yes, certainly these stimulus packages and the choices that are being made now in many ways really represent the big bets that governments are making in various future sectors. And as you said, investing in these high carbon pathways completely can undermine all of the efforts that we have made so far. And how a global Green Deal fits into that could be sort of the tide that helps us all to shift. So now I think with sort of knowing some of these initial sort of thoughts from all of you, I really want to dive into some of the more details about what actually this might look like. What have current efforts really help to pursue? How can we kind of bring it all together? And as this conversation happens, I really do want to encourage our audience, please do submit questions. I have no doubt that as the conversation evolves, that you will have a lot to say. So please don't be shy. As Nick told us in the beginning, the Sustainable Innovation Forum is really about enhancing your networks. It is about being able to have these types of conversations. So please don't be shy. All right, so diving right in, let's talk about current green recovery efforts. Maria, you talked about stimulus packages, ways to start thinking about, have these efforts gone far enough? And certainly within some of the sort of more the activist community, sort of thinking about, well, how can we push this as far as we can? And we know Greta has this sort of famous quote now that green is not a color. Green is a color. It is not a recovery strategy. And that is a really powerful statement to say that really it is about where do these policies really, where does the rubber meet the road? So Rodolfo, why don't I start with you? Certainly, as a leader with the OECD, you must see a lot of these factors start coming together in relation to sort of the current green recovery efforts. Do you think that how are these green recovery efforts going? Have they gone far enough?
Well, first, we have to say that yes, we have to build back better. We are saying greener and bluer, because we are not only talking about the things that we have to do on land or terrestrial ecosystems, but also what we have to do in the ocean front, for example. What we have to do to preserve biodiversity in the ocean and worldwide. What we are seeing is that many of the stimulus packages and many of the recovery plans are covering very well the energy and transportation sectors. Sometimes housing, because it's easier to deploy these new clean technologies, solar technologies on buildings, on new infrastructure in cities, but it's not covering all the activities that are causing this huge environmental damage to the planet. Let me talk very clearly about agriculture. Now we have alternatives for the agricultural sector, for the livestock activities, forestry. Now our societies are demanding organic food or goods, products that are free of pesticides, agrochemicals that are also harmful for the environment, for the ecosystems. So we have to cover those sectors and also include the sectors that are dependent of clean energy, clean transportation, or low carbon foods like tourism, for example, is a sector damaged because of the pandemic in recent months, and they are trying to recover their activity. It will be half of them for the countries that are living from tourism activities in Europe, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. And the way to recover their activities is not very clear. What are the technologies that they can deploy immediately in the following 12 months in order to have more sustainable tourism activities? There are other fronts of work that we need to improve to manage pollution problems as plastics. For example, we used to say that, well, you solve the waste management infrastructure. They are doing very well treating wastewater too, but it's not true. We are not controlling microplastics. We are in control of plastics that are pollution. In many ways, we are exporting waste to other countries, and that's another problem that we must face. This paradigm of circular economy must be embedded in the new Green Deal. It is true also that we have to implement extended responsibility schemes for producers, not only in developed countries, but also in developing countries. But we need the laws there. At the moment, there are no real laws to create the circularity attributes of the goods and services that developing countries are providing to the rest of the world.
Thank you, Rodolfo. Certainly, I think we're seeing this in so many ways, this dynamic that you're talking about where we are addressing some sectors, energy, transport, housing, but then in others, they're sort of falling back, and agriculture, plastics, and how we can really start to really dive into those and help those to be promoted alongside some of these major sectors. certainly, I am assuming, Diederik, you with your leadership, you see this a lot, and certainly with the climate law, as you were talking about earlier, being able to have this holistic approach. How are you seeing this issue?
Well, yes, the climate law is almost ironic that we presented it in the first week of March, and now we know that was a week before the first lockdowns in Europe. And we presented it with a very clear message that we needed a climate law to actually for ourselves, politicians, policymakers, governments, in order to discipline ourselves for keeping on course for a long-term target, while it was evident that all of the time politicians get distracted by immediate urgencies that require all our attention. And then 1 week later, the biggest urgency ever came by. And it's good to see that the climate law and its principles still survived, and that we actually doubling down on the target, that we're doubling down on the investments needed for the green recovery. So we have a completely different circumstance than, let's say, 10 years ago in the financial crisis, where we somehow sometimes talked about a green recovery, but it never came about. And I think we are now in much different times. And I think that is partly due to society itself. The urgency is bigger, it's felt bigger. Greta Thunberg was mentioned earlier, but also because of companies. Companies are much further in their development and also have a completely different attitude towards this type of regulation and this type of ambition. In only a few years ago, when here in the Berlin Commission is seated, some environmental ambition was expressed. The building was stormed by the business lobbies to kill that ambition on arrival, because it was damaging for the level playing field and the competitiveness, etc., etc. And now it's completely the other way around. We get letters from companies, and not the smallest ones, urging us, asking us to step up to the plate, to increase our ambition, because they know that by doing that, we will increase competitiveness, we will increase our resilience for the future. So we are in a completely different time frame, which makes me very optimistic. That isn't to say that the work is done. We're not even halfway or even on a quarter of our journey, but we have a much better position right now in terms of the cooperation from society and businesses.
Great, thank you. And Maria, that now we just turn to you. I think what Diederik was saying about this type of cooperation. Can you say more from your perspective?
I think he's completely right, and he's receiving and reading those letters and taking stock, because there is more than 1,000 companies that have committed to set science-based targets. Companies are investing massively to get there. And companies need a strong regulation that helps them also invest, and that provides them the signal of going into that direction. I would argue that the green recovery plans, from the Women Business Coalition point of view, they need to have 4 important elements. The first, they need to be based on the best science available. The second one, we need to remove fossil fuel subsidies and introduce carbon pricing. The third one is that we need to account for the risk that companies are taking when not investing in the good technologies, and hence make TCFD mandatory. And the fourth, it's that we are in a critical moment. There's a lot of people that are losing their jobs, and when we create these stimulus packages, we need to look at which are the measures that can create more jobs and reduce more emissions, and optimize those. According to our study, there are 5 measures that can do this. If we invest in scrappage schemes where we replace cars by electric vehicles, increase the renewable energy investments and grid investments, and then introduce tree planting, energy efficiency, and circular economy, we can substantially create jobs and reduce emissions. But then there are the policies that need to accompany those stimulus package investments, that they need to be aligned. So 170 companies have written to the European Commission asking them to be very ambitious on their carbon, on their plans to reduce at least emissions by 55% by 2030. As Didier said, this, will help Europe be much more competitive and much more resilient, and business want to operate in that ecosystem. So I think for once, as he said, business and governments are aligned. So let's take this opportunity to work together and collaborate together in the implementation of these plans so that we can go much faster.
Thank you, Maria. And I think, Diederik, we've had questions flying in, and I'm going to direct the first one for you. It says here, the EU is a leader, but can do more to help developing countries to transition to a more sustainable circular economy. How can it do this? How can it do more for developing countries?
First of all, we can always do more, and I do think we can do more. We just made an assessment of where we are with that ambition to transfer of 100 billion a year to developing nations, as Rodolfo was already outlining. And well, I'm proud to say that the European Union takes its share. That's not to say that the 100 billion is on the table, but our share is there. But we can do more than that. And I think we should embark into a new era where it's not just the transfer of money and the transfer of knowledge and the transfer of technical assistance from rich to poor, to speak in the old-fashioned words. We need a mature relationship. And let me give you one example, is Africa. It's our southern neighbor with 1.5 billion people and about to be much more there, and an incredible economic opportunity. And we should develop that together. For instance, in the hydrogen sphere. In Northern Africa, there's a huge potential to provide clean energy, turn that clean energy into wealth in Northern Africa and into hydrogen for exporting it to Europe. And if we can get that partnership, a mature partnership, so not based on the old-fashioned relationships, but on a new one, much mature, much more adult, modern, and forward-looking, I think we can do much more than that. And actually, a similar approach could be towards the eastern part of our neighborhood, Ukraine, Belarusia, if democracy comes back over there. We have more things to tackle at the same time, but let's assume that will happen in the coming period, and then we can have those real new partnerships. So on top of the, let's say, transfer of wealth, because that's needed sometimes, transfer of technical assistance, also those real partnerships to develop a common future.
Thank you, Diederik. And certainly these partnerships really start to shape everything now. And one, of course, big piece of this with the recent news is the U.S. election, and what types of new partnerships are possible. The president-elect Biden has said that they want to join the Paris Agreement again. And so I want to ask the panel some of your opinions on this. How can we ensure that the Biden administration sort of enters this global dialogue and really encourages a race to the top? Rodolfo, why don't I start with you?
Well, thank you. It's a very interesting situation because now with the Biden administration, it will be again feasible for many of us to work in a multilateral environment. I'm very optimistic. Let me tell you why. Because I used to work very closely with the Obama administration, and we created, as Europe created, a long-term climate program or plan, a mid-century plan for North America. At that time, it was feasible to work with Canada, United States, Mexico, to think in a common market for the region, to think in very aggressive, of course, goals, the deployment of renewables in the region. And with this new administration, perhaps we will be able to rescue those ideas that are not only related with the things that we were talking about here, but are related with the survival of multilateral instances, multilateral organisms that can create the necessary critical mass to really accelerate the pace in the implementation phase of the Paris Agreement and in the new Green Deal. We still have key challenges in recovery plans that we have to address to create a sound foundation for a global Green Deal, like overcoming inertia, ensuring that emergency response measures do not relax environmental standards and regulations. We saw that the past administration in the US did it. So we need to avoid that, and also to avoid a lock-in on sustainable infrastructure and resource extraction that we also saw in the past administration. So we are really expecting that this new administration, the administration of President-elect Biden, rejoin the Paris Agreement, have an integrated climate recovery, and also that accelerates plans for net zero transition in the United States, in the North American region, and with many other key partners they have.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Rodolfo. Maria, can I ask for your reflections on this?
Yeah, well, I think, it is fantastic news. So we saw in the past few months that in addition to European Union, we have Japan, South Korea, and China that have net zero goals. So with hope, and I'm sure that we will see soon that the US also joins this movement on the race to zero. And it's really a race to zero, because the one that wins the race will increase competitiveness, export technologies, etc. 5 of the 6 largest companies in the world are American, and they all have net zero targets that are well ahead of 2050, which is fantastic. But we need to mainstream climate action into the business community that goes beyond these large companies. And so, because as some of you may know, most of the emissions of large companies from what is called Scope 3, which is their supply chain. And so we absolutely, across Europe, Japan, China, and the US, need to work to mainstream technologies, business models, and solutions, so that then they can be scaled worldwide. So we are entering into a decisive decade, and I'm so glad that we have leaders that are stepping up their game and their ambition to get us to halving emissions by 2030 and be on the way to net zero by 2050.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Maria. And I'm looking at the clock here. Time has really flown by. Thank you so much. And so I do want to ask all of you to sort of reflect. We've touched on a lot here in terms of what the possibilities are, what are the types of partnerships we need at the table, the different sectors, the types of things that we need to be able to be as ambitious as possible. And so, Diederik, I want to start with you. I also didn't get to you yet on the U.S. question, so I would love some of your thoughts about how all of this comes together in this new context.
Yes, well, as Rodolfo already said, it's a huge opportunity, a new administration in the US. But I also want to say, and we're going to need it badly, because after all the optimism of this session, I also would like to close with a shot before the bow, sort of a warning shot. What comes next in the next coming months will be the real test. A second wave, a third wave, a downturn in the economy, and a rising unemployment. That will put politicians and policymakers and companies to the real test. Are we going to stick to that long-term ambition? And what we need for that is obviously a commitment and a sense of urgency, but also much more innovation than we have seen so far. The last 10 years have been pretty good in terms of innovation for renewables, much better than the first decade of this century. But actually, the third decade of this century, the next 10 years, that should be the decade of innovation, where we jump forward in offshore wind, also in floating versions of it, in a new battery technology that will enable us to drive much further, and also have heavy transport, battery electrical vehicles, and etc. So we need a lot more of that. So what I want to stress at the end of this panel, before I have to drop off, be aware that for the next period of time, keep concentrated and keep focused, because the real test is about to come.
Yes, certainly the real test of mitigation, adaptation, technology, all of these different pieces of it. Certainly the way that we make decisions now are going to influence generations to come. So Maria, can I go back to you in terms of your thinking with all of these different pieces that we have talked about, and in particular with your role as CEO of We Mean Business, really being able to bring together all of these different partners around the table, really being able to help business, as you mentioned, these 5 out of 6 largest companies are in the United States. They do have targets, but we do need more. We need all types of companies at the table, really making these ambitious moves. So can you tell us a little bit more?
Yes, thank you. Well, certainly it's nice to take this role at this moment in time when we see so much ambition coming from companies. And so we need to align that ambition to a common purpose, whether it's these net zero goals, which cut across the areas. But I'm very interested in advancing, especially the conversation on 3 areas. First, on the how to abate sectors, we need to find a different way to accelerate action through radical collaboration on those sectors. And we are partnering with the Mission Possible platform to do so. Second one, to scale the use of natural climate solutions, because they have an incredible link between the nature and the climate, and it creates additional benefits. But we need to make investment in that area in a credible way. And thirdly, I agree with Rodolfo. Circular economy has a fundamental play to role. It needs to start with a redesign on products and services, so that we can maximize the use of materials and minimize the waste that comes out of those. Those are 3 areas where business are absolutely encouraged and aligned in finding collaborations. The second area is that we need to create unprecedented, or what we call radical collaboration in sectors. Companies are really good at competing against each other, and they're also learning that they can also collaborate with their competitors, because there are some problems that need to be tackled across the sector. And we hope to see many more of those. And finally, the third point, we want business to speak up and to talk, whether in public events like this one about what they're doing, or whether also on the trade groups and lobbyist groups, because we want policymakers to be listening to the good stories and to the potential that we see on the green recovery and green plans. This is a decade of innovation, I agree, and business is ready to partner amongst themselves, but also with policymakers to unlock these innovations and to scale them in the same way that we have seen the scale up of renewable energies, and we will soon be the one on electric vehicles.
Great, thank you, Maria. I love this radical collaboration that we need. Rodolfo, over to you.
No, the words of Maria are very enlightful, because it's the way I think that the industry can react, not only because of the pandemic and the necessity of having a green recovery, also because we have to have a long-term vision that must be sustainable, must be inclusive, and for sure we can improve our quality of life without destroying the planet. If we count with responsible industries or corporations, as Maria was saying, we will really create a better world, and it's the thing that we are expecting, and the population is aware of that. The population is trying to also collaborate in the creation of a new normal that must be better. We think that now we saw clean air conditions in our cities. We saw wildlife return to our neighborhoods, and we were able to really taste a sustainable way of life, but of course with a lot of sacrifice with these confinement conditions. But it is true that the new normal must be greener, as I was saying, bluer, inclusive, and we are expecting that. And we will be working on that.
Yes, indeed, through this radical collaboration of making, as you said, a new normal, but a better normal. And certainly, I think that this panel discussion has set the tone for these types of conversations throughout the Sustainable Innovation Forum. Thank you so much for joining us. It was such a pleasure to hear your perspectives on these topics. And certainly, we hope to keep this conversation going. For everyone out there, we know we didn't get to all of your questions. Please do chime in online. We are reading them, we are listening, and it's going to be a really great 5 days. Thank you so much. And Nick, over to you.
I've been reading many of the questions as well. So let me just give you some sense, some taste of the kind of things that are on your mind as you watch that kind of panel. First of all, from Barry Chattington, Editor-in-Chief of CCE TV, this is a very big question. How does the panel believe the best way to capture the general public imagination and involvement for sustainability? In other words, how do the skeptical public get engaged in all of this? This from Robert Mostyn, director of myecocost.org, about has any thought been given to how we incentivize the individual consumer to engage with planetary boundaries? This from Amir Setu, Chief Executive of Lendurance. The issue is about how you create a sustainable recovery, given that less than 5% of $13 trillion of global stimulus is at the moment going towards sustainability. This from Maria, an ESG analyst. My question is related to how veganism is addressed, because after energy, the agricultural sector is the most carbonized sector. And finally, this from Cyrus Mbuga, who's a sustainability professional, asking about how the EU can become even more radical, not least because developing countries need to make a transition to a more sustainable circular economy. Much more of that through the next 5 days. I want to give you a taste that we are listening to those of you who are out there. Now, I'm now going to introduce you to this clock. 7 years, 45 days, 21 hours. What is it? This clock represents the total amount of time we have remaining at the current levels of carbon emission, just 7 years, not 2030, but 2027, before we reach, quote, irreversible climate tipping points. That needs to be a driver of everything we're trying to do during this Sustainable Innovation Forum. How can we move things forward? And I'm looking quickly to a message that we got during that panel, because it's leading us into the question about how can software realign us with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And David Benjamin, Managing Director and owner of Aqua Naturae, said, do the big investors still invest most of their climate investments into software about sustainability and not physical infrastructure and healthier built environments? In other words, how the variables on a company's balance sheet could be changed dramatically to push them in the direction of sustainability. Well, joining me now from Mannheim in Germany is Thomas Saueressig. Welcome, Thomas. You're a member of the executive board of SAP, the accounting and software giant. Welcome. Because
hello.
You
Nick,
are already moving down that track, Thomas, and we want to hear about what you're doing with what you're calling Climate 21, which is only a couple of months away or 6 weeks away. But how software, your software and software can now be used as a multiplier for change and embracing sustainability, picking up on what we've just heard from David Benjamin.
Yeah, Nick, so first of all, also thanks for having me here. And let me also explain the Climate 21, because 21 is not standing for the year 21, but quite frankly for the 21st century, because we deeply believe that climate action and climate change needs to be our focus throughout the entire century fundamentally. And I think also in the panel we heard loud and clear the need and the sense of urgency why we need to act. And you mentioned the question, I mean, can software help? And I fundamentally believe it can. And that's something where I truly believe if we want to tackle this challenge together, which we need, and you showed the 7 years we have, then we need to work on the innovation on all fronts. So yes, software can absolutely help to reduce the climate and the CO2 footprint on a sustainable manner.
How you're saying that, why you're saying that, what is it about a company's balance sheet which can actually make them fundamentally change their behavior?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because if you think about what is managed through software, this is the entire value chain, not just the four walls between a company, but also across all the supply chain and the suppliers which we have. And also in the panel, they talked about the greenhouse gas protocol scope 3, which is also including the CO2 emissions across the supply chain. And in order to manage that, you need to track and monitor all of the transactions and flows which you have, and therefore you need software. Think about transportation, think about warehouse management, think about all the distribution you need to have. And also these days, quite frankly, with all the online commerce which is happening, you still need to send packages somewhere, and to optimize all the routes between the companies, to reduce inventory levels, to establish a circular economy with regards to, for the one company it's waste, for the other company it's the starting point. This is something where software fundamentally can help, which we want to embed. And I also do believe it requires a mindset and cultural shift. I think this is very important, because we talk too much in companies about the top line and the bottom line, basically about the revenue and the operating profit. But I do believe we need to introduce a new dimension for success. Let's call it green line for a second, because I truly believe we need to define success differently. And that starts with all of us thinking differently about that notion. And I would love to read a quarterly statement or a yearly statement from a company which doesn't start with the revenue or operating profit, but rather with kind of how they help to reduce the carbon footprint. I think that's the mindset switch which we need to see in this world. And again, here you need to have that auditable. You need to have that in a manner that you can really get all the information. And that's again where software will be able to help here.
Thanks, Thomas. I mean, you're with us for 15 minutes. Let me encourage anyone like David out there to come through with questions. But what about the metrics? What about the data? Does it exist at the moment in measurable form, which allows you to broaden and deepen the way you are able to operate the software you are proposing?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, because if you look to most of the companies, they actually currently struggle to really analyze all the data they have. And for sure, that's also data coming from everywhere, basically, which we need to bring together. And that's the reason why we defined actually a way how we can integrate all these third-party data which you need in order to calculate and track the end-to-end value flows and data points, basically, to bring that to, first of all, an analytical application, which gives you the opportunity to monitor and track the CO2 emissions, but rather than just actually monitoring that, we need to manage it, which means we need to act. And that's something where also the decade of action, I think, is all about. What we see, that we take this information and put it into action to actually change our supply chain, our processes, to change the respective things, to actively reduce the carbon footprint. And that's something where I quite frankly also believe from our perspective as a company, with the customers we have, serving the largest companies on earth, if we achieve to reduce the carbon footprint a little bit, all of our customers, and multiply that, that will have a massive impact. And that's the reason why we need to start now, all together in partnership, with all the customers, partners, NGOs, and governments of the world. Yeah.
Well, Thomas, you can create the software, but how much of a radical rethink does this require? The mindset change within companies, large, medium, and small?
I think the mindset shift, that will be actually the biggest challenge we will face, because as I mentioned, it's so deeply ingrained in all the business cases that companies talk about return on investment, total cost of ownership. But I rarely see an RFP process where they basically ask for, as part of the success, again, to reduce the CO2 footprint. But I believe actually the radical shift is something which we will need to see, because I personally see that wherever I look in, that all the consumers and customers are asking for solutions and are looking for parties from which they buy from, which are more sustainable. So the pressure from the consumer and customer side will be big. I also believe the pressure from the employees will be big, because employees, they want to work for companies who are looking forward to a long-term success, for a sustainable future with purpose. And that's the reason when we think about the war of talent out there, you can only win the best talents if basically every company has this deep purpose to reduce and to help us on the challenge with the climate change. And that's something which is accelerating. So customers, employees, but for sure, financial investors, and we see that everywhere, they now embed actually as part of their investment strategy the notion around sustainability. And that's really serious, because that will help to trigger that change also for the corporations to really follow. And last but not least, the pressure will be increased with governmental regulations, the new restrictions we see around the globe. So I truly believe that the Paris Agreement was actually a great start, and the 1.5 degrees Celsius is very important. So also we are deeply committed in science-based targets like that and have that as part of our cooperation. And I hope that many others will follow actually and follow the lead to really drive sustainability with purpose. So I believe the radical mindset shift will be accelerated.
Excuse me. Thomas, tell me about the dynamics you're seeing at the moment. Are you now seeing boards? Are you now seeing C-suites who are actively moving in this direction and you're providing the software? Or are you seeing bottom-up pressure, both from customers and, as you say, even employees, which is really radicalizing the minds from much lower down in a way which, frankly, boards and C-suite should be thinking about off their own back?
Yeah, I actually believe I see both. But I think I see both in a way that I would hope that we need to accelerate it. So I absolutely, in my conversation with the boards of various companies, they ask for that and they think about how can we do that and what do we need to change from a company perspective to really embed it.
But they're doing it off their own back. They're doing it off their own back at the moment, are they? Or are they being forced by a breach with conformity, which they hadn't been thinking about?
Yeah, I think it's starting now. I think this movement is starting now. So I think that helps. But I think we need to have accelerate. I mean, you talk about 7 years. You mentioned it so nicely, the sense of urgency. And we just start these things. The good piece is we have the means in place to really actively reduce the carbon footprint. But we now need to act together with this sense of urgency. That's what I would hope for sure, to see more in the corporations to start thinking differently about that problem and how we jointly can make that. So I would say there's a long way to go still, and we need to raise still the sense of urgency on that topic.
Yeah, but time is of the essence here. Let's get a bit technical now from those out there who are watching and obviously invigorated by what you're saying, Thomas. Here, this from Rob Wilkinson, strategic advisor for UK Fires at the University of Cambridge. What are the key challenges for SAP to measure Scope 3 emissions in fragmented global supply chains, reaching into low-income countries? But that helps us understand what you're looking at. Scope 3 emissions, can those be measured in a balance sheet?
Yeah, no, I mean, where we are really working on is, on the one hand side, we will embed this entire dimension of sustainability, like the CO2 emissions, into our data model. So basically, in all of our applications, you will fundamentally find these notions that we track this entire end-to-end process. And SAP is providing software for production, manufacturing, for the distribution, transportation. So all of that, which means we can cover this end-to-end process. But, and that comment is extremely important, it only works if we can also embrace third-party data, which we need to include into the calculation. That's what we do with an open architecture to leverage this big data, fundamentally what we see out there in the world. And if you think about our customer base, for instance, in the automotive sector, basically all the large OEMs run our software, the suppliers run the software, even to the tier end supplier, till in the end of the middle, which is the starting point. And we really look about this end-to-end process to optimize that. And we see a great positive momentum about the customers to really join that together with us. So this is a partnership.
Now, Thomas, let me tell you, you've lit a fire out there. The questions are streaming in. So give me short answers if you can, please. This from Adish Rakcheka, founder of Leap. Where does this lie on the priority list of CEOs and CFOs, especially when we talk about business performance not being compromised while going for reducing carbon footprint goals? This is the core dilemma, isn't it?
I think what I see is that definitively on the C-suite, it is on top of the mind. It's currently a little bit overshadowed with the pandemic because companies want to maneuver in an agile way through the pandemic. But I would argue that right after that, the priority is certainly climate action. And I think this is something you saw the World Economic Forum in Davos beginning of the year, which was the main topic was about climate change. And this is something it is on top of the mind. And I think that's the positive that we are all united in tackling that climate action topic.
All right, Thomas, this from Peter Easton, Director of the Notre Dame Alumni, Professor of Accountancy at the University of Notre Dame. The measurement of sustainability issues, accounting for sustainability, assurance of the accuracy, validity of these data, related what should be the role of the accounting profession and accounting educators. In other words, there's a big reskilling and re-awareness challenge here, isn't there?
Yeah, and that's a very valid point because we don't do that in isolation. So SAP is an extremely partner-oriented company. Like all the big fours are participating actually to help us to make that rock solid because we also want to have that auditable in this regard. So basically we will take this knowledge into account. We leverage our partners, our system integrators, which are part on that journey as well. So I think that's a very important notion for me. This is not that we want to do something alone and believe we can do that on our own. No, by no means. This is an activity which is compromising basically the large consulting services companies, the audit companies, the big fours of the world, which are part of our program here. So we have strong partners together to make it in the right way.
Now there's data and there's data and there's data. And this from Melina Kakuratu from TfL. Data on its own does not do the work. We need to have clever questions to analyze the data. How can we achieve this?
I mean, that's I think something where anyway, also the notion about big data doesn't help us. It's not about big data. It's about what you do with it to make it a smart data and to take the insights out of basically to take the real the insights out of the data. Otherwise, it's so much data and it doesn't help. And that's the reason why it's absolutely right. We need to analyze it in the right fashion, but we also need to have the semantics aligned. So what do we want to measure and how do we take that in a consistent way that if we talk about something, about a metric or a KPI, that we all talk about the same thing. And this is also something where I believe we need to partner to really have global standards, way more than just a greenhouse gas protocol and the likes, but really that we have an aligned semantics and measurement about that thing.
Now let's understand a little bit more about not the top line or the bottom line, but your green line, Thomas. Help us understand more about that. What does it mean? How do you define it?
Yeah. So basically the green line is basically the third dimension, which is really representing sustainability as a success criteria for a company. And this is something which is for sure combining the environmental KPIs, like to see that we get to a carbon neutral future fundamentally, but also the social, so all the ESG dimensions which you can imagine. And we should talk about it as a company, as part of a regular reporting to the market, to talk about how are we with regards to equality, for instance, how are we with regards to the health of our employees, how are we with regards to, again, all the environmental factors. And here, this is where SAP wants to be an exemplar and a front runner to talk about it. We started the integrated reporting already in 2012. We are with basically renewable energy for our data centers already since 2014. And we have also the plan to be carbon neutral by 2025. So we really push forward in DEC and want to be an exemplar. And we talk about it. We want to talk even more about it. And we hope that other companies join here to really, if we talk about the success of a company, that we automatically talk about those things in the same importance than purely the top line and the bottom line of a company. And if we achieve that, then actually we came a long way.
Let me offer you two questions here, which I think are a bit related. This from Christian Zauner, Director and Trustee of the Climate Science Limited. Thomas, do you think that it makes sense to be able to run scenarios regarding potential upcoming CO2 pricings so companies can plan ahead? And this from Priya, who's a student at Ohio State University. How is reduction of CO2 emissions through software different from cost minimization?
I think, first of all, I also think the notion around carbon pricing and the carbon tax is actually something where you clearly see the need for software to support it, actually. So the planning of all of that is certainly a key aspect, but also the continuous improvement around it. And then also with regards to the cost reduction question, I mean, this is actually a very valid point. We should definitely spend the same amount of time where we talk in the company about cost reduction and the levers to do so, the same about actually the CO2 reductions. And this is still missing in some of the companies, I sense. So I think that's spot on, this question.
Peter Thompson, Director of the World Update, why not define what accurate, reliable, complete current information is needed to hit the 1.5 degree target rather than talk about data? After all, data means given, not necessarily accurate descriptive words.
I think this is, as I laid out, I mean, we need to come to this aligned metrics, aligned language and semantics, which we measure. And this needs to be a standard on a global scale, which we follow. Otherwise, again, we will not hit the mark. So I think that's absolutely in line of the thinking here.
Okay, this from Fentahoun Tamini, lecturer and researcher and officer on good governance and institutional transformation at Debre Marcos University. How are softwares working on the CER system and the relations to the carbon market? Is that something that's embedded in what you're planning?
I think we for the carbon market, I think this is something which is talked a lot since quite some time, and I think that's certainly something where we all need to get aligned around it, because so far this is not yet existing, and I think we need to definitively get real about it. So yes, it's partially part of our program, and I'm more than happy actually to get into a deeper conversation about how we can help on that front also technically to do so. Yeah.
Let me broaden this into how you coordinate and have partnerships and have engagements with investors, companies, cities, regulators, NGOs, and every individual. Is it about you as SAP trying to not impose but move it into the market so the market responds? Or are you responding to what others have been saying to you, it's about time that?
I think it's the right moment actually to really get it in a scale. I would not say that we need to push it because our customers are asking for it, but I certainly believe we're one of the front runners in the software industries, because this is something where I believe we need to help our customers, and it's a clear demand which we see from the customer side that they need help in all of that. And this is something where we have the great foundation with our software, because we already run all this process. We run the productions and all of that stuff for our customers, which means we have an extreme good starting position. So with simplicity to provide additional capabilities, like our product carbon footprint analytics, which you just can place on top of the existing estate of solutions, and then basically you have the transparency which you need. So we have a great starting position, and we absolutely, quite frankly, see the obligation from us as a company to help here. I mean, more than 77% of the world's transactions run through an SAP system. We have more than 400,000 customers. So we clearly see that we need to leverage this momentum and this scale to help to reduce the carbon footprint. That's something where we basically in the company decided that this needs to be our top growth initiative, which we double down on. That's the reason why we double down on the R&D investment for that topic, and really together with our ecosystem of partners jointly take that as a strategic focus topic. And as I laid out, the demand from the customer base and also from the partner side to join here is phenomenal. And that's the reason why I'm so confident actually that we really can move the needle and really can help here along the way. And as you showed it to us, the time is here of essence, so we don't have any time to lose, and you can be assured this sense of urgency is absolutely understood from our end and our partners to help our customers.
And I'm afraid we're almost out of time, but I want to get this one in to show the kind of fire you've lit. Tom Moran, Sustainability Strategy and Innovation Lead at EMEA from Lumen. How do we deal with the issue of data ownership in the context of so many technology companies that treat data and its analysis as a commodity that drives their profits and their business model?
I mean, this is actually an extremely fundamental, important question because, for sure, topics like GDPR, data protection and privacy in general, these are for sure extremely essential for all of that. And here, SAP as a European company headquartered in Germany, I mean, is certainly from that perspective, we absolutely not only recognize it, but quite frankly, we want to definitively be actually differentiating with our perspective on data protection and privacy for our customers. So it's absolutely clear the foundation for trust, the foundation for all of that is that we leverage this data in a purposeful manner, and SAP has no business model at all to sell data or to do something with that data like other companies, and that's the reason why this is a foundation for all of that, to make that, especially if you think about the scope 3, which means the data across the supply chain, and that's something where you need to have a neutral party really with the highest standards of data protection privacy to make that work. And
Thanks,
that's
Thomas.
where we are 100%
Thanks, Thomas.
committed to.
There are a couple more comments here, but they probably don't need an answer. Or you don't need to give more than a one-word answer. There's one question here from David Benjamin, who asked the first question before we got into you. Does SAP have low-cost solutions for softwares for SMEs who can't afford the big solutions? And also there's a question here, I can't actually immediately find out who asked it, asking about whether this requires some kind of task force and whether SAP wants to be part of that. Very quickly.
So we have absolutely solutions for smaller companies as well, which are cost effective. And yes, I think for companies, I mean, if you want to start that, we are happy to join their respective task forces to help. Absolutely.
Thomas, this has been great. Thanks for joining us from Mannheim. And of course, people can join you in your virtual expo as part of the Sustainable Innovation Forum to keep the conversation going. As I say, I think you've lit a fire. There are other questions there which we've managed to get through a lot of. So many thanks indeed. As a layman in this, it sounds absolutely intriguing. I can see where you're taking this. And I can imagine that the green line is going to be something which is well defined within the profit and loss account and all the metrics very quickly. And as you say, there's no time to lose, and the time is over my shoulder. And you can see that we're still 7 years away, but it's the time is marching on relentlessly. So, Thomas, first of all, thanks for supporting this forum.
Thank you.
And secondly, thanks for getting through so many questions. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you very much, and stay safe and healthy.
And you too as well. Who knows what's coming around the corner. Now, we're going to take a break, which will be just over 30 minutes coming up. What's up next after that? Please go away, have your juices, have your coffee, relax, and then come back. We're not going away, we're just pausing for the moment. Then we'll have a live discussion on finances. Are we taking climate risk seriously? Is the first discussion with Eric Usher, who's from UNEP, from the financial initiative there, the head of it in Geneva, and John Colas, the vice president of Oliver Wyman, who is the giant management and risk consultancy. He'll be joining us from New York. And to round off the day, this first 3 hours of the 5 days, we're going to be talking about finance. That's going to be hosted by Nick Robbins of the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics, asking the question, can the green stimulus close the SDG investment gap, currently standing at $2.5 trillion US dollars? Remember, plenty of platform features, plenty of rooms into which you can go, plenty of ways of contacting other people. You can get a sense of the number of people who are out there to set up meetings and build new partnerships. But please join us again, probably in about 30 minutes, and we'll be back at 15:15 GMT, or that'll be 16:50 Central European Time. Join us again then. Please come back.
This is our world. Beautiful, isn't she? But it's much more than a life-supporting ecosystem. In fact, it's a complex web of communities, economies, environments, living creatures, and more, all in one. But don't let that throw you off caring for our planet, because it's now more important than ever. Introducing WaterBear, the world's first streaming platform dedicated to the future of our planet. Built to simplify the complex by providing us with the technology to support life on Earth. Watch, connect, take action. Inspirational content on demand wherever you are, whenever you want. Over 70 highly effective charities, global campaigning nonprofits, and top nature conservationists from across the globe. Make a difference to both global and local issues that matter most. Let's make this life the best it can be, because there's no alternative. This is our world.
Actually, the thing have you got double sided?
You've done it.
Welcome back. Hope you had a productive break. It's always good to have some time away from sitting in front of a screen. But what we hope we've done is energized you in the first half of this first day of our 5-day Sustainable Innovation Forum, which goes on between now and Friday. What's coming up next? In the next hour and a quarter, we're going to have a live discussion on finance, because this today is about climate policy and finance, the critical nature of finance and the way it can inject new energy, as we saw at the Horizon Summit here, the Green Horizon Summit in London last week. Live discussion with the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative, joined as well by Oliver Wyman, which is the global leader in management and risk consulting. The question for them: are businesses taking climate risk seriously? The emphasis on climate risk seriously. Then after that, we'll have a panel discussion led by Nick Robbins, who's from the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics, steering that panel on can the green stimulus close the $2.5 trillion SDG investment gap. So that's what's on the agenda for the next 75 minutes. Now, I'm going to remind anyone who's been watching us that you can still fire off your questions. That's what we want to receive. Notice the number of questions we got in the first hour and a half. As I said to SAP, to Thomas from SAP in Mannheim, I said, you've set our question list on fire, because so many of you were wanting to ask questions, and we'd like to have that sense of community and engagement. All of this is being recorded. That means that all sessions will be available to view on demand. There's also a transcription within a short time after each session. Do visit the Expo, because even though we're not meeting you in person, the Expo is still there. Use all the app features, network, connect, engage, meet people, even if you're not meeting them physically. Hand over that business card electronically. And finally, do please bookmark your sessions so you don't miss anything in the next 4 days. How to ask questions? Well, this is how you do it. Go to live discussion, click on the questions. Let us know who your organization is or who you represent, if you can, and also to whom you are addressing. And of course, we'd like to hear from you in many different ways. You can either do it on the app, you can do it on the site, or you can, of course, do it through social media with these hashtags. Hashtag Climate Action Live, or one word, at climate_action_ and hashtag SIF20, SIF20. Do please get your questions in now. You can see how I'm able to at least push them out at high speed once we get them, but don't leave it too late. So let's now move on to that question. Are we really taking climate risk seriously? Certainly the polling evidence, including from the European Climate Foundation this morning, suggests that there is now a very serious public pressure. Joining us from New York is John T. Colas, who is a partner and vice chairman of Oliver Wyman, and Eric Usher, who's head of the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative. He's joining us from Geneva. Welcome to you both. Great to see you, both John and Eric. But I'd like to ask you, first of all, and John's joining us from New York, Eric, you're joining us from Geneva. Can you literally, in less than a minute, give us the answer to, are we taking climate risk seriously? First of all, John.
Nick, thank you for having us. Pleasure to be with you. Thank you to Climate Action for organizing this. In a 1-minute answer, I would say yes, we are taking climate risk seriously. There's been tremendous progress since the initial launch of the TCFD. And while there's still much work ahead, we can take real pleasure and comfort in knowing how committed corporations are in embracing the recommendations of the TCFD. The latest status report had over 1,500 signatories to the TCFD, representing 60% of the world's public corporations. The NGFS has stepped up in its direction and supervision of banks with respect to climate risk. It now regroups over 70 supervisors and central banks. And we're encouraged by the net zero pledges of over 1,100 corporations around the world, 50 financial institutions, and of course, countries like China and South Korea really pushing hard on net zero commitments as well.
All right, well, let me just check, John, that you and Eric are in agreement. Eric.
Yeah, absolutely, and fully agree with John. And I think that it's a yes, and many are moving forward essentially on what does this mean for their businesses. As we all know, data is a challenge. Having the right sort of comparable data. Corporates don't have at their fingertips the data that investors require to integrate into their climate risk models, but there's no longer an excuse to sit back. And there are a lot of important developments, particularly right now, coming from the regulatory front, really sending the emphatic message that if you are not on top of figuring out what climate risk poses to your business, then you're going to get left behind. And therefore, essentially the time is now. Regulators, customers, investors, everyone essentially is sending parallel messages and very important developments that are efforts, I think, to make it easier, even if we all have to acknowledge that it's still going to be a tough slog going forward to really get clarity on where the risk is and what we need to do about it.
But both of you, let me just check with you. You're talking about 1,500 there, John, who've signed up. There are vast numbers of corporates out there. Many of them are simply not in the same game as the major corporates. Are those who are the SMEs taking this seriously as well? Those SMEs who are struggling currently with the COVID crisis, with liquidity, staying afloat and so on. I mean, I've heard, for example, that many companies where sustainability and climate change was close to the top, they've had to relegate it for the time being. Quickly, both of you, is that your perception as well, John?
Nick, it's not my perception. I really believe that if we think about business, the future of business is sustainability, and that good business leaders are actually thinking through holistically, what does climate mean to their businesses? Are there more efficient ways to manufacture products? Are there more efficient ways to distribute products? Are there more cost-effective ways to digitize business? I don't think that's limited to only the signatories of the TCFD. I think all business executives are compelled to embrace sustainability on a go-forward basis. And while COVID has been a very unfortunate disruption in the global landscape, I do think that businesses overall appreciate the need to embrace sustainability. And when you look at companies like Walmart, who are embracing and encouraging their suppliers to implement sustainability programs, I think it's only a matter of time before all businesses really step up and participate in this commitment.
Large, medium, or small. Eric, do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, now our work, we're not working so much directly with SMEs. It's really with the finance industry. But what we hear really is that there's not a separation between the pandemic and sustainability considerations. They're seen as being part and parcel. And, the pandemic has been described as a real life stress test of the resilience of companies, of communities, and entire economies to unforeseen risks posed in the system. And, we come out of this one, hopefully we're going to have stronger health systems. But as we know, the climate crisis poses potentially much larger risks. And of course, the hope is that we don't wait to be fully in the midst of the climate crisis to start thinking about what we need to do with it, to do about it. We need to act today.
Need to act today. Well, let's drill down then, John, if we can. You mentioned the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. How much is that in its own way? It's a mouthful, TCFD, unless you're someone who knows what that is. It's still a mystery to many people. But how much has that been a driver? And what are the next drivers that are needed to keep up the momentum? Because right at the start of today, I made it clear that this was about creating momentum, creating acceleration as well.
Right. So, Nick, what I would say is the TCFD is a principal driver in that it's bringing to the surface a transparency on the exposures and risks that companies face with regards to climate. And providing this additional information to markets will help ensure a more rational and informed allocation of the world's capital, and therefore catalyzing more developments toward a green and sustainable future. What I would say in terms of other work that lies ahead beyond just the completion of disclosures is really to integrate climate risk management in strategy and business decisions. And ultimately, I think it's going to be very important, as was cited last week by Governor Mark Carney at the Green Horizon Summit, that ultimately there needs to be a framework that draws upon the insights from the TCFD that really is there to ensure every financial decision takes climate change into account. And the TCFD is a great catalyst to get companies to identify those risks and to begin to identify not only the risks, but the opportunities and the governance associated with implementing change toward a net zero future.
And I should say we had a senior executive from SAP, the major accounting software, talking about an hour ago, and he created a blizzard of questions, but talking about how the variables and the data can swing significantly the way profit and loss are going to be calculated in a sustainable environment. Eric, do you agree with what John has said? What more, again, what is going to force the pace, given the urgency? And you can see the urgency over my left shoulder, which is 7 years to go. That's not 2030, that's 2027, before we run out of our
I mean, I don't think we can underestimate the challenge involved that TCFD essentially has put in motion. So basically, TCFD is how you start to disclose on climate risks. But the real challenge, as we know with the climate, is what's happened in the past is not likely a proper representation of what's going to happen in the future in a changing climate. And therefore, the core of the TCFD recommendations of the notion of doing forward scenario analysis, or basically becoming predictive of how the future is going to change and how those changes are going to affect us as a business, as a corporate, in terms of our business strategy, or for a bank or investor, the portfolio of companies that we own or we lend to, how is that going to change in the future? And it basically asks those who are providing these disclosures to start doing scenario analysis on the future. So if you're a bank and you're lending to the automotive industry, the companies you are lending to, how is their business model going to allow them to transition to a low carbon economy? Should they be continuing to finance companies who mostly focused on internal combustion engine, or should they be going with the new movers like the Teslas? So it is a new type of risk management, which no longer is looking back at loss histories and what failed in the past, but it's actually getting much more sophisticated in terms of understanding the future. It's challenging. Some would call that crystal ball gazing. The capacity that's needed, and you referred to for the data challenge, is significant. So we need new models. We need a new ecosystem, essentially, of service providers who can help corporates and those who finance them get the data that they need, turn that data into decision useful information, and based on that, essentially help to navigate a way forward.
John and Eric, I've got a lot of questions coming in, but I want to ask you one last question each. It's the same question, really. How open and honest, transparent, and hands up are a lot of companies now about the nature of what they face? Or are they still, to use that phrase, greenwashing, purpose washing? There is a degree of washing as opposed to fundamental change. John?
I would say that while greenwashing has been a concern over the years, I think at this point, what one really has to ask is, what is the commitment behind the vision that so many corporations have expressed? And I think it's incumbent on all of us, as we recognize climate is a collective action problem, that we not only support executives and corporates in their follow through with their vision and commitments, but that we also hold them to account, so that we provide, as Eric said, the necessary ecosystem, data, and tools to analyze and assess climate risk on a scenario basis, but also that we hold and expect reporting to ensure that executives are living up to their commitments. So I see it much less of a greenwashing challenge than just the practical fact that there's much work to be done to realize the visions that have been expressed along this journey to net zero.
Eric?
I mean, I think the pressure points have increased considerably. And, whereas in the past, civil society organizations are the ones who are mostly leading the push to get corporates, onto a sustainable trajectory. Today it goes much wider than that. And in any transition, you always have the risk of green or rainbow or whatever you call them washing. And therefore, you need to be careful. In the EU level, they've come up with a taxonomy, which is getting a lot more clarity on what is a sustainable activity. And in many other countries now, there's a push to get clarified taxonomies, which I think helps push us in the right direction. However, I think coming back to your wider question, even from the employees to the customers, to the regulators, to the investors, to civil society, there is a growing pressure and understanding that if you, as a corporate, if your head is stuck in the sand, you can only survive so long ignoring changes that are happening around you. And therefore, disclosure, which means essentially reporting where you see climate risks, is the first step. And you can't change what you can't measure. Once you measure it and disclose it, that's not the end of the game. Of course, then that raises questions about your business strategy. Is it future fit? And what sort of steps do you need to be taking? And I guess the last point here is we're seeing a ratcheting up on a sectoral basis in terms of comparing companies. So if you take the aviation industry, I think there's an understanding that people will need to get around in tubes up in the air to some extent. They will also use Zoom and the like as well. But there are certain companies that are moving much more quickly in terms of low carbon aviation than others. And those are the ones who probably hold the keys to successful strategies in that sector going forward. The same discussions are starting to be had in almost every industrial sector today, and even into areas like agriculture as well.
Eric and John, we've got a lot of questions, so can I ask you to keep your answers as sharp and to the point as possible? This is fascinating from Christian Zauner, Director and Trustee of Climate Science Limited. It's quite a long question. I think I'm going to summarize it like this. He asked, can we really say that we take climate risks seriously when we don't agree on a remaining global carbon budget that is scientifically sound and doesn't give us 66% or 50% chance on reaching it, but a 99% chance? And this is the point. If I would act like that in my companies regarding my financials, I would have a good chance of getting fired.
I mean, I'll take the first response to that. I would say, wait to the next session. We have a group of investors called the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, and there will be a couple of representatives from that who will speak shortly. And they will basically say exactly what the question put forward here is. We need to work from a budget. We need to work from the science. And using the science, we can essentially look at individual sectors and challenge those sectors to say, who are the leaders in aviation, in transport, in energy, etc.? Who are the ones who are going to be science-based in making a transition to net zero based on preferably a 1.5 degree trajectory? Those are the ones where capital is going to need to flow to. And those who are head in the sand, who are not on that trajectory, well, increasingly, we're going to have to engage with those companies, try to get them to change strategy. And for those who really don't change, well, maybe we need to direct capital away from those businesses.
John.
I would just add to Eric's response that there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty in this context. And where I think risk managers need to go is the scenario-based approach, which has been developed and expressed by the NGFS and will be implemented in the PRA's stress test. And I think that that's what we need to do, is begin to not only presume that enough is being done, but really to do it, and to do it with a world of uncertainty, which means embracing scenario analysis, running multiple scenarios, and really holding to account decision makers in terms of what the potential consequences of those decisions can be.
This is a short question, but it goes right to the heart of what we're talking about, the risk. From Kate Gimblett from KG Consulting, sounds like her own firm here. Is there actually a shortage of climate risk professionals? John.
I would say that climate risk is an area, it's a new area, if you will, within risk management. There has been a commitment from GARP and other industry associations to develop training and certification programs for risk professionals embracing climate. So the short answer is it's a big problem. It needs the world's talent mobilized against it. And there's room for highly motivated, highly analytical, thoughtful people to marry the financial theory and the climate science in order to make progress.
And I would fully agree
I'm
with
mindful
John.
of, and let me just put to you that Rian Mary Thomas, who's the new chief executive of the Green Finance Institute, made very clear in the Green Horizon summit, which John just mentioned last week, there are simply not a lot of people out there who understand that the way they got their jobs is not the way life is now under climate and sustainability issues. Is that your perception as well, Eric?
No, absolutely. And I would say for the young who are listening, this is probably one of the most important growth career opportunities that are out there, because all large organizations are, I don't want to say falling over themselves, but as John said, there's a lot that needs to be done to build the capacity of organizations and those who support them in terms of the services industries to put in place the right sort of skills. And this is quite a change from a risk management perspective, some of the issues we've raised. Scenario analysis and stress testing is it's not simple. And when the regulator is moving fairly quickly to basically starting to make it mandatory, and UK last week becomes the second after New Zealand to make TCFD reporting mandatory, and others will follow, the skills you need to do it properly, very few have that today, and therefore the answer would be yes. It's the time to build those skills, and no, we don't have all the capacities in place yet or already.
Quickly, can they be developed? Quickly, both of you, can they be developed at the speed that is necessary, given the imperative and the urgency which we've had from Ban Ki-moon, we've had from so many people today, and which was clear at the Green Horizons Summit last week? John and Eric, quickly, if you can.
Nick, yes, they can be developed quickly. I think, as Eric said, there's an ecosystem that's emerging. We're part of that ecosystem. We're bringing forth analytical tools together with S&P Global to help accelerate the tools that risk managers can avail themselves to. And I believe that given the world's emphasis on stress testing and scenario analysis throughout the great financial crisis, there's a cadre of professionals who can cultivate the next generation of talent to lead us through this challenge.
Eric.
And just to add to that, I would say that, part of the reason I think risk disclosure has made great progress is because of the relationship between regulators and companies, where the regulators essentially have said, well, you need to start disclosing, but it's complicated and we're not going to tell you exactly how to do it. And so the private sector really has been in the driver's seat to start to demonstrate how such disclosures can be made. Now regulators are starting to pick up what they're doing, and they are going to start to mandate it, but based on the approaches that the private sector has led on. So the relationship, I think, has worked quite well. But of course, we're just getting started. And a lot of it is not only about the models and the scenario models that we have that are going to get employed, but it's the people who are going to employ them. I think there is a lot of growing expertise out there, but we have to admit that it's not at the scale that's needed in most corporations and most investors and banks today that are needed to really function in a way that it's decision useful and you can actually adjust and tailor your portfolio over time based on such information that needs to be generated now.
All right. Well, look, that's great. I'm going to summarize 3 or 4 questions here with the following question, and can I just get a minute from you each? Our question when we started this was, are we taking climate risk seriously? Could I suggest that the redefinition of that title should be, are we able to calibrate climate risk accurately and seriously? John, is that a more precise and more accurate description of the challenge that we really face, given the urgency of what is confronting us all?
I think that is a more accurate characterization, which is we are moving into a category of risk where, fortunately, we don't have a history to backtest against. So the challenge now is we're looking at a forward view of the world, and we have a lot of uncertainty around that. And so are we prepared at this point to make the right decisions under those scenarios? And can we make those deploying the best capital and making the best use of society's resources? And that is, in essence, the challenge, Nick.
All right, so it's about changing the mindset. And Eric, quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a wide array of risks at play. There are the physical risks of climate change. There are the transition risks, which are the how policies and technology are going to change, what risks those pose. There are liability risks for those who know PG&E, for instance, companies being put out of business by the liabilities that they have related to a climate event. Just to talk about the first grouping, the physical risks, if we think of a large international company, to actually understand the physical climate risk on that corporation, you actually need asset level data, which means you need to know where all of the factories are around the world and which sort of climate risks, whether it's higher temperatures, it's sea level rise, it's all the other secondary effects of climate. So you need actually not to know, where that corporation has their headquarters and their financials. You need to know everywhere where they operate around the world. You need data to tell you essentially at the asset level what sort of risks are they running today in terms of climate risks, and what sort of business changes are they making which will reduce that risk exposure over time. So the scale of the challenge is significant. I think, coming back to your question, we need better tools, better models, and a lot of those are in development. We need the capacity within organizations to use those models, and a lot of training is underway, but we're still at the early part of the curve there. There's going to be a significant uptick that needs to be made to really get all of this underhand in the very short time zones, timeframes that we know we have available.
Eric and John, thank you very much indeed. I'm just going to summarize this. There's a risk of not having the skills and the expertise, and a danger that the climate risk is going to outrun our capacity to handle what needs to be done in this very compressed time period, as illustrated by the clock over my shoulder. Can I thank you both? There is a comment here from Andrew Mackenzie of Glencore. Expo, you mentioned linking to the Expo. What is the link to that? It's not obvious, at least to me. But look, can I thank you both and encourage those who are watching to join you in our Expo area, both Oliver Wyman and also UNEP FI. Thank you both very much indeed for pushing us down an awareness of what risk is and how we need to define it and the changes. I'm running a project called Thinking the Unthinkable. It's about thinking differently about what risk is. So John, thank you. Eric, thank you. Look forward to seeing you again and catching up, not in 10 years, but maybe 10 months or even 10 weeks at the speed that we need to move. Thank you both very much indeed.
With pleasure. Thanks very much, Nick.
Right, let's now move on, building on what particularly Eric is working on with finance, to the issue of how to close the US dollar $2.5 trillion development gap, aligning public and private finance with the SDGs ahead of COP26 in those 12 months which are still to go. Let's now go over to Nick Robbins, who is Professor in Practice for Sustainable Finance at the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics. Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nick, and great to be with you all. And thanks to the last couple of speakers for setting up so well. They talked about risk. We're now going to talk about actually how do we mobilize the capital, both to respond to those risks, but also I think to see some of the opportunities, the positive opportunities for people and planet that sustainable development represents. I think COVID has clearly taught us that we need to transform our economies to become more inclusive and resilient, and not least to be resilient in the face of the threats from our mismanagement of nature, not least zoonotic diseases like COVID-19 and climate change, which is coming on behind and acting as a threat multiplier. Good news, of course, is we have the roadmap to get ourselves out of these problems, agreed a few years ago, 5 years ago now, the Sustainable Development Goals, including the Paris Agreement. That really sets out the targets and the pathways for finance and what finance needs to do in the rest of this decade. And we have the financial resources. By latest count, we have about $380 trillion in assets. So that's all the bank balance sheets, all the pension funds, the insurance funds, the central banks, and so on. $380 trillion in the financial system. So we're not lacking in resource. And we have evidence of change by investors, by banks, by central bankers indeed, and indeed by citizens. And what we need to do now is change that process of capital allocation, change that process so we're channeling at least $3.5 trillion, as you were saying, Nick, to make sustainable development a reality by 2030. In the process, eliminating poverty and regenerating nature. The problem, of course, as many of us will realize, is that most of the world's financial assets are currently not aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And so the panel this afternoon, in the next few minutes, we're going to really try and look at this in a very practical way. And I'm delighted to be joined by 4 real leaders in this first. First, Urban Angern, who is Group Chief Investment Officer of Zurich Insurance, a major investor, and he's also one of the founding members of the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. So welcome, Urban. Then we'll have Sean Kidney, CEO and also co-founder of the Climate Bonds Initiative, a real change maker in the fixed income and bond markets. Sonia Gibbs as well. Welcome, Sonia, Managing Director and Head of Sustainable Finance at the Institute for International Finance in Washington, D.C. A real overview of what's happening in terms of the global trends. And then Margaret Kulo, who's currently the Interim Global Conservation Director at WWF International, which has been a major player in sustainable finance. So we're going to look on this panel the sort of critical steps that need to be taken in the next 12 months, obviously in the run-up to COP26, but also the rest of the decade, so we can close this gap. Now, there are many, many things we could discuss, of course, but I think the 4 themes we'd like to touch on and really unpack. First, obviously, is how we make sure that the COVID stimulus and recovery programs from governments and central banks really do accelerate the financing of sustainability transition. And so we can make a reality of this mantra of build back better. So that's the first challenge, the sort of how we exit COVID. The second is how do we better connect the financial system, these $380 trillion in assets, with the real economy, with the households, the businesses, the entrepreneurs, the governments who actually want to make the transition now. How do we make that link between the growing number of institutions that want to make sustainable investments and real projects on the ground? The third is really how do we make sure we're not operating in silos? Sustainability is a complex game, but we need to be better able, I think, at joining the dots between the social and the environmental, between the climate agenda and the nature agenda, so that we can actually deliver a just and inclusive transition, particularly in the developing world. So that's the third challenge. And then really, there are some big systemic transformations ahead, and we need to think about what's the role of different actors to enable those transformations, roles such as investors, central banks, and so on. And really looking forward and welcome you to submit your questions to the function, and I'm going to be picking them up and bringing them to our panel as we go through. But I just wanted to sort of kick off with some opening thoughts on that agenda, and starting with you, Urban, as Group CIO of Zurich Insurance. You are also one of the founders of this Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, and it'd really be interesting to get, in a sense, a little bit of the inside story from you, and also the sort of key steps you see as a leading investor to tackle climate change. So, Urban, if I could invite you to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here. This event, of course, is about all of the Sustainable Development Goals. But among the goals, frankly, from our perspective as a large institutional investor and as a large insurance company, there's one that is above all, and that is, in fact, tackling climate change. That's not to say the other SDGs are not important, but climate change is related and connected to the others in such deep ways that it can honestly be said, if we can't tackle this one, if we cannot go net zero by 2050, we will fail on many of the other SDGs as a result of that. So as a company, as a large insurance company, we have now made a number of commitments around climate change, around decarbonizing our portfolios. We've signed a 1.5 degree pledge as a business that affects our assets, our liabilities, and our operations. We've committed to make our assets net zero by 2050, and we have joined the Asset Owner Alliance. And so next, while the Asset Owner Alliance is busy working towards the first set of goals, while that is happening, what is really needed is that the coalition of finance that aligns behind net zero becomes much wider, much broader. The asset owner alliance today represents $5 trillion of assets. That's a lot. It's 30 large members, but I think we can really take a lot more engagement behind that. It takes analysis of the climate risks. It takes analysis of the footprints. It takes planning, and it takes engagement with issuing entities. So it is a serious effort, but that is in fact the role of finance on the path to a sustainable future. Of course, policymakers also need to chip in. I'm not the expert on that, but frankly, we still don't have a high enough and widespread carbon price. And if you want the private sector more involved in the creation of solutions, as opposed to just going sideways, then a high enough carbon price would make a mass of a difference. And so if we tackle that, if we solve that together, we play our role as finance, the real economy plays their role, governments play their role. If we do that all together, then in fact, solutions around climate change can help on mitigating poverty, on sustainable cities, on having biodiversity remaining in plant life or in ocean life. And that is how crucial, in fact, the climate change challenge is.
Well, thanks so much, Urban. Thanks for setting that out for us. And it's a very, very interesting initiative, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, and I think it's great to see that coming through. And I liked that point about sort of putting pressure on the real economy. We'll come back to that. So, Sean, over to you. In many ways, the green bond market, the sustainable bond market, is really at the vanguard of many of these changes. I think now $1 trillion in total issuance in green bonds. Where do you see the bond market and the sort of the global fixed income market really playing a role in filling in this $2.5 trillion annual investment gap that we have before us?
Well, first understand what we've done of this green bond market. We've created a market that's around use of proceeds rather than an ESG analysis of companies. So any company, if it's invested in solar, for example, as one example, can issue a green bond to finance that solar or refinance that solar. Same with rail, etc. This has led to something very important, which was clear guidelines around assets and activities that qualify. And in fact, the fruit of that labor is the work we're doing in the EU taxonomy, which is around exactly what kind of investments comprise the shopping list for the Paris Agreement. This is absolute measures, not relative. We have managed to leave behind the best-in-class approach. You know, the Dow Jones Sustainability Index used to have best-in-class coal companies included. In an absolute model, that just doesn't quite work. So let's think about this as the triumph of science over political constraint. In the work we're doing in the CBI taxonomy, and most importantly in the EU taxonomy, we have a very definite focus on what the science says has got to happen, and then we look at the political constraint issues. This is after 30 years of listening to the scientists and saying, oh, that was great, but let's just try this because this is what we think we can do. That's changing. So that's the triumph of the model of the green bond market. But of course, the other part, the story of the green bond market, has been a continual expansion of understanding of what are the assets and activities that do qualify. And here we've got the issue of resilience. You know, first, infrastructure hardening, climate resilience. But we've learned from the pandemic, as you said earlier, it's a zoonotic disease. That is pathogens jumping between species as a result of degraded environments. Guys, this has been predicted by the IPCC Committee for 30 years. They're telling us the 21st century will be a century of pandemics, as well as other shocks we're going to get. So understanding how we bounce back from these kinds of climate-related shocks is now part of an understanding of how we become resilient in the face of climate change. And therein lies the bridge.
Thanks so much, Sean. I think that was really, really important. You made that point about how I think the sort of green bond phenomenon has not just sort of set rules of the game for the bond market, but also for the rest of the financial system, as we were seeing through the taxonomy that has been developed in the EU and other countries. So thanks very much for that. I'm sure we'll pick up themes around taxonomy later. I'd like to turn to you, Sonia, if I may, sitting in Washington State, I believe, in the US. You are the managing director and head of sustainable finance at the Institute of International Finance, which really has that sort of global view about really some of the rules of the game that guide this process. I'd be really interesting to get your view on maybe the role of financial regulation in this process. I mean, central banks have been and others have been a sort of relatively new, but now quite influential actor in this process. And also, obviously, your thoughts on the implications of President-elect Joe Biden for closing this sustainability financing gap. So, Sonia, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. And I think you raise really important questions that are fundamental to where we're going on sustainable finance policy and regulation. I just wanted to add to what Urban and Sean have set out on the role of the private financial sector and markets for both public and private funding of the SDGs. And I want to focus on three areas: policy, regulation, and potential changes in the US landscape. First of all, I think to maximize the potential of sustainable finance, we absolutely need effective and well-aligned policy and regulatory frameworks at the international level, regional, national, and local levels. Climate and ESG risks are uniquely challenging to assess: their scale, how quickly we can adapt and transition, and how these risks are transmitted to the economy and the financial system. And of course, these risks are uniquely global in nature, and so we need a united front to address them. So the key concern here is fragmentation. The key problems are inconsistency across jurisdictions, divergence in how central banks are approaching climate scenario analysis and stress testing, and also the inconsistency at times between policymaking and regulation. So I think, international fragmentation can generate a really costly and inefficient patchwork of requirements and rules that constrain how well financial firms can operate across borders and scale up the necessary financing for the SDGs. And on the policymaking front, even as international organizations, NGOs, national governments urge the private financial sector to scale up sustainable finance, there are still regulatory disincentives to taking on some of the kinds of risks, credit risks, that would support the SDGs. For example, in infrastructure projects or climate vulnerable emerging markets. Uncertainty about the future of regulation, for example, whether changes could be introduced to the prudential framework, could be a deterrent from taking action as well. And turning to the US from the perspective of the IIF space in Washington, D.C., the second point I wanted to emphasize is that we are on the brink of a potential sea change in sustainable finance policy in the Biden administration. And understanding how the US might shift gears on climate and SDG goals will be fundamental to building global alignment on policy and regulation. So the president-elect and his team have set out a really ambitious climate agenda, rejoining the Paris Agreement, a $2 trillion plan to spur the transition to clean energy, net zero by 2050, and much, much more. I think there's a lot of concern about how this will play out in practice. Obviously, anything to do with green fiscal stimulus will require working with Congress and a potentially Republican Senate. But the Biden administration still has considerable regulatory authority through the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Air Act, to regulate emissions. And moreover, setting credible targets, interim targets toward Paris goals, will require the Biden administration to elevate climate change across all agencies of the US government. So in this context, I'd highlight findings of that September report from the US CFTC on managing climate risk in the US system. They're particularly on point, and we'd expect progress on many of these key recommendations, including, ideas about the US setting a price on carbon, and especially that US regulators and federal agencies should incorporate climate risk into their mandates, and that the US should engage internationally. And finally, greater action on US climate policy offers tremendous opportunities for US leadership at the international level. And here I'd highlight the G20, the G7, regional forums like APEC, and also the international regulatory apparatus, the Financial Stability Board, the Basel Committee, and other standard setters. So greater US leadership in partnership with Europe and other forward-leaning jurisdictions could make an important contribution to closing the SDG gap by fostering a better aligned global regulatory and policy framework. This would help unlock both public and private investment to support the SDGs.
Well, thanks so much, Sonia, and I think really good of you to highlight that seminal report from the CFTC looking at climate risk in the US financial system. And it was interesting to see news reports that the Federal Reserve is requesting membership of the Network for Greening the Financial System, the sort of central bankers club. And so I think we do see some really major shifts, and those are really just the beginning. And I think having a G20 that really sort of drives us forward on sustainable finance will be important. So thank you for that. Margaret Coulot at WWF, if I could turn to you. Obviously, WWF has been really championing climate issues, environmental issues, biodiversity issues for decades now, but also you've been really applying your expertise to the finance sector. It seems to me sometimes we do look at these issues of sustainable development somewhat in silos and separate them out. What's your sort of sense of the urgency of joining the dots now, particularly in the financial sector?
Thanks a lot for the question, Nick. And I'm harkening back to the discussion that happened just before we came on with this panel about expertise and what kind of expertise we need in the system going forward. I think at essence, what we're looking at is a really complex interdisciplinary problem and challenge and opportunity for different sectors, different areas of expertise to work together. Let me start first with the conceptual, and then I'll go to the practical on how we join all the dots. Last year's Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, this is from the Intergovernmental Science and Policy Panel that supports the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. They opened with a discussion of nature and its contributions to people. They did a great job of mapping the global biodiversity loss, global ecosystem services, to the services that people need. There's the obvious critical role in providing food, but also the linkages to energy, the linkages to medicine, and the critical systems that bring us clean air and fresh water. And the report detailed, including in a separate publication on pollination services, for example, about 75% of our global food crop types rely on animal pollination. And pollinators altogether provide a service of about $235 billion a year to global food production. The report also shared the alarming finding that about 1 million plant and animal species are at risk of extinction, many in our lifetime. And this level of biodiversity loss risks undermining progress on about 80% of the Sustainable Development Goal targets that they looked at, including targets related to poverty reduction, ending hunger, health, clean water, and sustainable cities, just to name a few. So, as we mentioned earlier, COVID-19 has made pretty clear the linkages between the way we treat the world around us and our own health are critical. Deforestation, land conversion, habitat destruction, and wildlife trade all increase the probability of pandemic spillover events. And when you add in climate change, that significantly increases zoonotic diseases in general, including those that have really high disease burdens already, like malaria. So the linkages are clear. And what that means for finance, I would say, is two things: risk and opportunity. We've talked a bit already about risk and climate. We recently joined together with partners Global Canopy, the UNEP Finance Initiative, and the UNDP to launch an informal working group of about 60 financial institutions, corporates, and some regulators to develop a task force on nature-related financial disclosure. It's modeled again on the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosure. And those recommendations will increasingly, the TCFD recommendations will increasingly become regulatory requirements in the coming year. So we're a little bit behind that initiative on nature, but it's becoming so clear that we can't solve the climate crisis without our natural resources. COVID has created a combined health and economic crisis for us. And if we aren't able to join these dots, we really won't be able to get a recovery that makes us resilient to the next crisis, be it pandemic or the physical risks of climate change.
Well, thanks so much. I think particularly economists and statisticians have been looking really at the sort of the economic and financial materiality, let's say, of biodiversity, and have struggled, I think, to show its importance. And I think that question has really now been answered this year with COVID, with obviously the direct human suffering and loss of life, disruption to people's lives and livelihoods, and then there's sort of trillions of dollars in extra debt that we're taking on. So I think really with this disease, which has its origins in the disruption of nature, I think really that centrality of nature is going to be an important one. I'd like to sort of reach out to the audience. We've got some great experts here. We'd like to hear your questions. And if you'd like to input some thoughts and questions, please go to your live discussion tab on the dashboard, click on questions, and then let me know who you'd like to ask questions to, and we'll try to bring those into the discussion. So I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that we've touched on. The first, obviously, is the moment we're in, which is the moment of COVID. We now do see, obviously, a lot of effort being placed by governments to stabilize their economies, and some of them now putting in place recovery plans. I think so far, I'd say the sort of evidence suggests that the sort of the greening of those plans is somewhat underwhelming, I think. And we really need to make a lot more effort to make sure that these are going to accelerate the process to net zero and make sure we don't lock in damaging assets. But maybe, Sean, you mentioned earlier that you were working at the EU level, but there is a recovery plan. And how do you see that recovery plan, again, linking to the world of finance, and particularly in terms of sort of new assets that, I don't know, investors such as Urban and others could be investing in as we make this recovery process?
Sure. Well, the starting point is we've got a 750 billion euro recovery fund, resilience and recovery fund in Europe. A third will go to green. That green will need to be broadly in line with the taxonomy. We've got a bit of catching up to do because in the fund, we haven't actually put in specific hard-coded compliance to taxonomy. It's a bit of a loose business. Essentially, the designer said, hang on, taxonomy is not ready yet. When it's ready, come back to us. But broadly in line. And that will be funded by raising green bonds. So you're going to see something like $250 million of AAA green bonds coming on the market to fund the Recovery and Resilience Fund. That's against total issuance of green bonds of about 260 billion yet last year. So pretty large fill up of the market, liquidity, benchmark pricing benefits to the rest of the market. But the interesting thing about what we're doing here is the Recovery and Resilience Fund, the other 2/3 still has to be argued in the context of resilience. So member states, when they're getting or arguing for a grant or a loan, have to say how that money will support the improvement of resilience in those member states, and then have to ensure that they're not doing harm to other environmental objectives. These are learnings for us all, because that's what we have to do everywhere. So that's a pretty big development. In the EU taxonomy, which will define all sustainability reporting by investors, banks, corporates in Europe going forward, we're now developing criteria to backfill in some of these areas. The European Commission has engineered the issuance of, I think, 28 billion or thereabouts of social bonds so far to fund a bunch of things. But the actual rule set in that area has not been developed. So we've got a working group in the EU platform developing a rule set around social investments that will come into force later on next year, specifically to try and develop that. Now, this is where the bridge that I mentioned earlier comes in, because the learning out of the pandemic is that resilience is not just making your railway less likely to be flooded on the coast. Resilience has to be how our economies, societies, and our health systems can deal with these kinds of crises that are going to become frequent in the 21st century. So it expands our conception of it. The UN Sustainable Development Goals can be seen as indicators of resilience and, of course, indicators of climate resilience. They are. You look at every single one of them, and there's a story and an evidence base which shows you how it works. That doesn't mean there's enough detail in the new SDGs to make it urban's life easy yet. But this is something we want to work on this year. We will work on this coming year, fleshing out that universe. So we link what are intrinsically important things themselves, like the education of women, back to climate resilience. You know, in Bangladesh, a third of all deaths from climate incidents are women. And they're women because they don't have education and they're stuck at home, and the men in the cities working. So when floods come in through, it's the women who die and the kids. That's a human rights issue and a climate issue, a link between an SDG and a climate issue. The education of women is one of the key antidotes. The education of women also leads the participation of women in society and reduces inequality. We know that inequality is a predictor of the collapse of societies when there's a crash, etc., etc. You can now see this ends up being one big story of lots of complexities, not separate silos.
Very good. Urban, your name was called out there. And I mean, you're a chief investment officer. You're having to steward hundreds of billions of dollars on behalf of your clients and so on. Is this mantra of building back better, is that becoming real for you? Or what do you really need to see more so that you can actually, your investments can be part of that recovery process?
It's a good question. I mean, we would certainly, if we talk about the EU Recovery Fund, which Sean has just mentioned, that's definitely a development that we highly welcome. The insurance industry is a natural holder of fixed income because we have medium to longer term liabilities that we need to defease. Some of that fixed income needs to be liquid, so having very liquid green bonds over less liquid green bonds, the ones that we've held for a long time, that is an advantage. AAA green bonds, that is an advantage. And we have committed to invest substantial volumes into green bonds. We hold more than 4 billion today. So definitely we can play a role, and we also welcome those developments. But at the commercial finance depends crucially that investments that we make pay the right return for the risk. This is not about us, right? Zurich Insurance. This is about mobilizing private capital. You can mobilize private capital if assets pay the right returns for the risk taken. And there finance in the private sector cannot be the solution for everything, because of course many valuable from a public policy point of view, sustainability point of view, projects do not have that type of return. There, of course, the solution can be, this is about public goods, and it needs to be in partnership between the private sector and the public sector. And again, we play a role, but we are just finance. We are not the world. We're just we provide some glue, maybe, some lube, but we're not everything.
Right, that's a very nice way of putting it, I think, Urban. So Sonia, in your opening remarks, and I know this is something you've been working on, we've been actually quite North Atlantic centric, let's say, in our discussion so far. We've been talking about the EU, we've been talking about the US and so on, but we know most people in the world don't live in the North Atlantic, and most of the investment we need for sustainable development needs to be in the so-called developing world, emerging markets and so on. Obviously, many of these societies have been hardest hit by COVID, pushing back many of the development gains we've made. So it'd be really interesting to see sort of how this question, particularly of mobilizing private capital in that development process, how that can go forward now in these uncertain times.
No, you make an extremely good point, and it's tremendously difficult. You have a double whammy with the COVID pandemic. First, you really hit growth and revenues for so many of these countries, whether that's tourism, remittances, exports, all of that's been reduced. At the same time, there's needed to be quite a lot of borrowing, both domestically and externally, to resource the pandemic response. So when we think about the SDG gap for developing and emerging economies, the first thing to understand is that COVID has exacerbated that. I mean, we all talk about whatever the numbers are, 2.5 trillion globally, but I think, considerable study needs to be done to update those and understand how the pandemic has affected them. And second, in the context of emerging and low income economies, it's absolutely critical to address the debt management and debt sustainability problems that have built up over the past decade. And these, of course, have also been made worse by the pandemic. Our recent calculations suggest that emerging market debt across all sectors now stands at a record high of 230% of GDP. And within that category, low income countries, many of which are, of course, climate vulnerable as well, are particularly at risk of debt distress. And when you have to service high debt levels, I mean, this just simply makes it that much harder to address other pressing priorities, whether that's healthcare or food security, any climate or sustainability related goals. So I think there are three key unlocks here. First, to make sure debt treatments, and whether that's like a short-term forbearance or debt service suspension, or restructuring more broadly, make sure that these incorporate SDG considerations and are done sustainably. Second, I think continued attention to building out the domestic investor base and local currency markets across emerging and developing economies is essential. And third, I think to support stable, sustainable capital flows to emerging markets. And that could be, Nick, as we've discussed, expanding the scope and range of SDG-aligned instruments, building liquidity in these markets, maybe working in partnership with the multilateral development banks to provide de-risking and credit enhancement, supporting both kind of traditional debt flows, but also non-debt creating equity investment, and of course, FDI. So a shared public-private responsibility in supporting these capital flows.
Well, thanks, Sonia. And Margaret, I know that from your perspective, you're doing a lot of work on sort of nature and people sort of led, people-centered investment. Are there particular things that you see as priorities now to make sure that this recovery really does work both for developing countries, but also for the nature agenda you talked about earlier?
Yeah, it's a great question. And if I could just follow directly on from what Sonia was saying about the opportunity of combining public and private resources, to Urban's point as well, not all of these investments are going to provide the kind of risk-adjusted returns that the private sector is looking for. There's a lot of great innovation in the public-private space around investing in nature, investing in resilience, investing in the resources that provide services back to us, like mangroves, for example. So I think as economies transition, again, to the point that Urban made about the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, that work is not just about the members making commitments, but also the members publicly advocating for the kind of economic transition we need, as finance provides that service to the economy we need, and economies transition to less harmful and more environmentally supportive economic activities. These financial institutions, both public and private, are starting to figure out how to finance those activities. So we've seen some great growth early in the innovation space from public sector instruments you'd expect to see on the early end, like the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund, which was set up to support the UN Convention to combat desertification. That has both government and foundation funds managed by Mirova, the French subsidiary Nataxis. There's the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development, supported by FMO. There's the new Nature Plus Accelerator Fund, which includes partners like IUCN, the Global Environment Facility, the Coalition for Private Investment and Conservation, again, and Mirova. And there's also this new partnership between Pollination and HSBC. So we see a major mainstream finance partner also come into this new innovation space. So I think then the key will be, how do we take this great new innovation work and apply the kinds of instruments like green bonds that can help you really scale the space. And I think the next challenge then will be getting from that small and growing corpus of individual investments into a scalable instrument like a sustainability bond or a green bond or other sorts of instruments out of the debt space.
It's really good to hear about those examples. Actually, I mean, as you say, the innovations is there, but I think it's the scale that we're now looking at. Urban, you were talking earlier, I think, about the role of investors, that you can't do everything, but you can lean on the real economy. You can set your demands or expectations of companies you invest in. You can use your engagement and so on. Maybe give us a little bit more about that particular role, about how you're sort of applying those expectations so we fill this investment gap.
Yeah, make no mistake, we're not withdrawing from our responsibility at all. It's just we are a player in a system. We have thousands and thousands of investee companies in our portfolio, and like-minded investors, large pension funds, other insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, have the same, thousands of investee companies in their portfolios. When we set out to say we're going to decarbonize our investment portfolio, starting with the public equities, the corporate credit, and the own real estate, so the equity real estate that we own. When we have announced that we would do that, and we're going to publish a target together with the other members of the Asset Owner Alliance in the first quarter next year. That sends a strong signal besides other strong signals that we've already been sending. We want investee companies to know that we track their carbon footprint, and that we will form a forward-looking view on their carbon footprint and whether or not that fits into our decarbonization path. They know that already at a level because we've talked about it, and our aligned investors have also talked about it. We also engage with companies. We are divesting from our coal investments, for instance, but we're not just selling. That's not the first reaction. The first reaction is, in fact, to get in touch with these companies and get an understanding of what their plans at transforming the energy generation in their businesses is. So we engage, and finally we also vote where we have voting rights. Well, not on the bonds, but on the equities, where we have voting rights. We increasingly influence these voting rights to take a particular position. So while we don't control what the real economy does, I think given the necessity of capital in developed economies, given that necessity, we have quite an important role to play. And in particular, if we play it somehow in concert, it'll be quite effective, I think.
And Sean, I mean, I think it seems we do have this potential sort of wall of capital needing to make this shift to an aligned financial system, but we have this sort of weakness in terms of the assets. I mean, this is a sort of market creation process. Can you tell us a bit more about how we speed that up, how we can speed that market creation process, that asset pipeline process?
Isn't this a fantastic position to be in? We've got the funds management industry keen, and the evidence is green bonds. Every time you do a green bond, it gets oversubscribed. Zurich's poor old portfolio managers can't get a piece because there are so many people knocking on the door trying to get a piece. This is just such a fantastic position to be in. What we need to do now is ensure that we can make it easy to extend into resilience. At the moment, resilience is complicated. A lot of things are complicated. Understanding what is the right kind of resilience versus the wrong kind of resilience. And let's face it, there are hard choices to make in the context of what we're understanding about the impacts of climate change and the impacts on our societies, our health systems. We've got to need to know now, what are the right health system investments to make post-COVID? Well, I'm going to tell you, I've learned a lot about PPE production locally, and I've learned a lot about supporting vaccination infrastructure, et cetera, which wasn't on the radar before. So making it easy for investors and market actors is step one. That's where the taxonomy takes us. Embracing resilience and the UN SDGs into that making it easy universe. So I want a company not to have to worry about whether they understand what is resilient, but to be able to look up a database and figure out what they're doing is, and figure out what the right kind of side of the equation they need to be on is, and then start spinning off financial products that Urban's portfolio managers can invest in. Second, we do need to look then at better ways of preferencing that kind of investment. Now, on the debt side, it's green quantitative easing or resilience quantitative easing. It's blended finance funds. There's a whole bunch of things, and Sonia touched on some of those earlier. There's a huge toolkit. We just haven't applied it. Of course, the last point, which is what you're getting at, is we do need to look at asset creation. And the truth of the matter is we are way, way behind on asset creation. Take land use, where our land use is currently dominated by deforestation and agriculture, the wrong kind of agriculture. We eat maize. Did you know that maize is terrible for carbon sequestration? Release it. Now, what are we going to do about this? Well, I'm going to tell you, if I can convince Margaret to eat quinoa, that is really good for sequestration. It's fantastic. So if we shift to a quinoa, trendy new food diet, not my like thing, then that is an investment in climate mitigation. But equally, there may be this GM route for maize, I don't know. But in land use, there's a whole bunch of things to do around resilience. And we've kind of got to do them quickly. And that includes water infrastructure and forest regeneration, etc. We've got the scientists. We have not bought it in to an understanding of what's got to be done, making it easy so we can spin off financial products. And for me, that is a 2021 job. Let's get that sorted. By the end of 2021, we won't have finished it. We'll never have finished it. But we'll look back and we'll say, here is the shopping list for asset creation and asset management when it comes to resilience investments to match the mitigation work we've already done.
Well, thanks. And this is a wonderful session. I mean, I'm really privileged to be with all these experts and leaders. But I must say, I'm going to give you all in the audience a 5-minute warning because we're going to have to bring good things come to an end. So please do send your questions and so on. But quinoa, Margaret, thoughts on that, but also maybe picking up the not just your favorite recipe or so on, but actually how do we take this nature agenda going forward? We now have all these initiatives you mentioned, the disclosure task force on nature, TFNND, and so on. But I mean, what do we need to achieve really in the next sort of 6 months through to the big biodiversity COP and then through to the climate COP looking forward next year?
Yeah, I think we've done a really great job in the last couple of years of increasing awareness of the linkages of how all these things come together. I mean, it's striking. You sort of think the SDGs only go back, the Sustainable Development Goals only go back really to 2015. And I remember being in Addis Ababa for the discussions around the finance agenda to serve the SDGs. And almost immediately after you had the agreement around the SDGs, you had major corporations with plans on where they were going to go based on the SDGs. It really provided this great sort of mapping. It took a little while for finance to pick up, frankly. I think the corporates were a little bit ahead, but finance is now sort of catching on to the SDGs. And in the context of COVID recovery, we have the opportunity for really job-intensive, people-centered investment that brings the SDGs together and brings the recovery to life. To some of Sean's examples, we did a study recently together with the ILO, WWF with the ILO. We found there are about 1.2 billion jobs in sectors that are linked to the sound management of natural systems, farming, fisheries, forestry, tourism, and nature-based solutions include many job-intensive activities like reforestation and watershed restoration and the agroecological approaches in food production, because we really do need a significant transformation in the food system in particular. So we now that we see and feel and understand much better how all of these things are really interlinked, we need to take that understanding and use it with our investment profile, both public sector and private sector, and really drive demand. There's tremendous public demand for the post-COVID world not to be just going back to where we were before COVID, but to be going forward to someplace else. And I think taking a nature lens and a people-focused lens can really change what our world looks like after COVID.
Thank you. We're coming to the final second. Sonia, I'd like to give you the last word. Really, you talked about the risk of fragmentation in terms of regulatory frameworks and norms and so on. So maybe give us your sort of views about how we can overcome that in the year ahead.
So I actually want to tie together two pieces here. One is the kind of overall framework, and the other is the opportunity set. Margaret's been speaking about this, and I wanted to highlight a solution, if you will, one of the many solutions we're going to need, and that is to scale up voluntary carbon markets. At the Green Horizons Summit, Mark Carney referenced this. It's a project he initiated, but private sector led, to scale up these markets, which are now really small and fragmented. Our task force is going to connect the dots, get the market infrastructure in place, trading systems, benchmark contracts, effective standards and verification. This is going to help, it's a win-win-win, right? You're going to help support emissions reduction and offsetting, help in setting a price on carbon, and facilitating flows to emerging markets where so many of these nature-friendly carbon offset projects are located. So that's going to be a key goal, I think, over the course of 2021 ahead of COP, along with efforts to promote alignment and better disclosure.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, time is a non-renewable resource, and we're out of it. So I'd like to thank you, Urban, for your wisdom, Sean, for your passion, Sonia, for that opportunity-focused remark at the end. Very, very welcome, and Margaret for bringing it all together. So thanks to all of you, and back to you in the studio, Nick.
Panelists as well on this very critical issue of money. So much available, but where's it going to go? Oversubscribed, as we heard from Sean, particularly on the green bonds. Thank you so much for that. Really underscoring one thing we're going to be doing on the final day, which is Friday, on land use and agriculture, day 5 of this forum. And I should tell you that the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, His Royal Highness, will be addressing the conference on that day about the challenges of land use and agriculture. Let me just offer you 2 or 3 thoughts of things which were being said in questions while Nick was chairing that. First of all, from Melina Kakarutu from TfL, investors telling European firms to reveal missing climate costs in their accounts.
Thanks, Sonia.
Where do they stand on firing to those who give false pictures of their finances? And also this from a master's student, beyond defunding, how can investors or society at large hold companies responsible if they are greenwashing? And finally, this from Alejandro Delmar from Cornell University. While biodiversity loss is today harder to grasp than CO2 emissions, how do the public and private sector start working towards developing integrated natural conservation in their climate plans? All of this underpinning what we're going to be looking at, certainly in the next 4 days. Well, get involved tomorrow as well. Join us then. But before we leave you, let's get a final thought from one of our main partners, our industry partner, SAP. You heard from Thomas Sauresig, who's one of the senior executives, talking about the new accounting process, which could drive a dramatic change in the way companies have to comply on sustainability, climate change, and addressing the climate emergency. Here are a few more thoughts from him before we wrap up at this time.
Dear initiators, sponsors, and participants of the Sustainable Innovation Forum, normally more than 30,000 representatives from policy, academia, and business, as well as climate experts and activists, would have come together for COP26, the 26th UN Conference of the Parties this week. With this year's events, COP26 has been delayed, but we cannot postpone the climate emergency. If we look at the warmest years ever recorded, we see that the past 7 years in a row are amongst them. And 2020 is already well on the way to become the warmest year ever recorded. That's not a coincidence, it's a trend, but a trend should not be our destiny. The race to net zero is already underway, and it's without a doubt a narrow race against time and our habits. If we still want to win, we must be fast and act now. No single entity can stop climate change alone. That is why it's important to come together in this virtual forum. We need platforms like uniting the public, private, and NGO sectors to drive climate change together. I'd like to take this opportunity to re-emphasize 3 key deliverables we as SAP see for COP26? First, we must not lose sight of our common goals from the Paris agreements. We need governments to set ambitious emissions reduction targets and policies enabled by cutting-edge technologies to tackle climate change. So far, it looks like only a handful of countries have renewed their pledges and defined climate action policies that are ambitious enough to meet the Paris Agreement goals. Second, since CO2 emissions don't stop at any border, climate action requires a coherent global strategy. Local complexities are creating new pressures to steer planning and decision-making globally and with greater transparency. The COVID-19 pandemic cannot be an excuse to slow down the efforts to stop climate change. It's an opportunity to rebuild better. That's why we need a common vision of a resilient, sustainable and fair economic recovery. Third, we advocate for a globally harmonized carbon market. We want to avoid carbon leakage and send a strong signal that low carbon investments are valuable today and in the future. The idea of advancing the global carbon market and involving as many countries as possible has been existing for a while. But to be honest, it hasn't been implemented yet. Let us address these issues together so that we can tackle COP26 in an even more focused manner in 2021. SAP is a strong supporter of the Paris Agreement commitments, and we reflect them in our own business operations. All of our data centers and facilities worldwide have been powered with 100% renewable energies since 2014. We have committed to set 1.5 degrees Celsius science-based emissions reduction targets, aligned with a net zero future and becoming carbon neutral of our own operations by 2025. Above all, we are particularly proud of the fact that we not only act according to sustainable principles ourselves, but can also support other companies in achieving their climate goals with the help of our solutions. Software enables our customers to gain real-time insights and act upon them, providing the flexibility and transparency needed to make an impact, even beyond company boundaries. With that, companies can take truly holistic approaches to their business decisions by incorporating economic, social, and environmental impacts. Let us work together in our joint ambition to reach the finish line in the race to net zero. Let's make the trend a wake-up call, but not our destiny. Thank you very much.
Thomas Saresic of SAP. We're most grateful to you for being an industry partner, along with BMW Group, which has been a headline partner, and also Oliver Wyman. And the OECD has offered important support for bringing together today's agenda. If I can just offer you a couple of thoughts before I tell you what's coming up tomorrow. I think there's been dramatic forward movement. You can feel momentum. There's an accelerator at work. There's a multiplier at work. Risk is now understood, as we heard from Oliver Wyman, from John, and from Eric from the United Nations Environment Programme. But there is not the capacity and skills yet to handle it. An urgent upskilling is needed, and that certainly emerged from the Green Horizon Summit this time last week here in London. So there was one sobering moment, I thought, when Rodolfo Lacey, the director of the Environment Directorate at the OECD, said some countries are locking in measures that have negative impact on sustainable growth. In other words, while there's reason for optimism, there are also negative signs, and how is that going to be overcome? So what's in store for tomorrow? Tomorrow is about the energy transition. It's about how to go from a pathway for a green, clean recovery into making big progress on that front. Energy transition. Now, you can bookmark the various sessions we've got in the app, but the highlights are the following. The former COP26 president, now managing director for energy at the World Business Council, Claire O'Neill. She'll be joining us for the opening panel. There'll be a special message from the former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, now the president of the Asia Society. And after the break, we'll have a special session from the 3% Club and the International Copper Association. That's all at 1:30 p.m. GMT, 2:30 p.m. CET, for about 3 hours, so it's not going to take up your whole day, but we're delighted by the number of people who've joined and contributed from wherever you are in the world. So from me, Nick Gowing, on behalf of all the team here at Climate Action, thanks for joining us. Back at the same times tomorrow. Join us then. Bye-bye.